Imagine waking up without an alarm, no phone buzzing on the nightstand, no traffic sounds filtering through the window, no schedule to check, no emails waiting, no meetings to prepare for. Instead, you find yourself stepping into the uncertain hush of a medieval evening, where the world outside and indoor holds more questions than certainties. What would it truly feel like to arrive as a modern traveller in such a place, relying on flickering rushlights and the uncertain goodwill of strangers whose customs differ in ways we can only piece together from fragments of records and possibilities? The idea sparks a quiet curiosity, doesn't it, about whether any of us could endure even a single night surrounded by the unknown rhythms of that era. Before we settle into this imagining, I wonder if you might take a moment to share in the comments where you're listening from right now and what time it happens to be for you. It creates a gentle thread connecting listeners across different corners of the world, each of us easing into these thoughts from our own evenings or late hours. Perhaps you're somewhere with city lights still visible, or in a quieter spot where the night has already deepened. This premise invites us to consider the experience of a medieval inn not as a fixed certainty, but as a series of possibilities drawn from historical hints. Travellers then moved along routes where shelter was never guaranteed, and an inn represented one fragile option among many. How might the transition feel if your own expectations, shaped by modern comforts, suddenly met the realities of shared spaces, variable light, and the constant awareness of who else might be nearby? The curiosity lies in exploring those contrasts without claiming every detail as absolute, because records from the period leave room for variation depending on region, season, and the particular inn itself. Picture the subtle shift in atmosphere as daylight fades, and the inn becomes the centre of activity for those seeking rest. One could imagine the air carrying scents and sounds that feel foreign at first, a mix of wood smoke, damp earth, and the murmurs of conversations in dialects that might require careful listening to follow. Would the lack of private boundaries immediately stand out, or would the novelty of communal living draw you in before discomfort set in? These are the kinds of questions that keep the mind gently turning as we drift further into the scene. As we begin this journey together, the goal remains to let the details unfold gradually, allowing curiosity to build around each layer of the medieval night. An inn was not simply a building but a crossroads where people from different walks arrived with their own stories, some verified in passing mentions from chronicles, others left to speculation. What if your arrival coincided with a busy evening when every bench and corner held someone adjusting to the same limited resources? The premise here is one of gentle immersion, testing the edges of endurance through imagination rather than assertion. Consider how the very notion of time might stretch differently without the familiar markers of clocks or notifications. In such a setting, the progression toward night could feel slower, marked instead by the lowering of the sun and the practical need to secure a place before full darkness. Would that adjustment alone begin to wear on someone accustomed to controlling their schedule, or might it offer an unexpected release? The historical picture remains incomplete, inviting us to wonder about the small adaptations travellers might have made, some successful and others less so, depending on individual resilience. This welcome to the medieval night sets the stage for examining survival in the broadest sense, not through dramatic claims but through the accumulation of ordinary challenges. An inn offered basic shelter in theory, yet the variables of weather, fellow guests, and available provisions introduced elements of unpredictability that modern contexts rarely replicate. How long would it take for the absence of personal space to shift from interesting to taxing? Such thoughts arise naturally when we place ourselves in the scene with open curiosity. Kindly drop a note in the comments about your location and the hour if it feels right, as these small connections remind us that while the medieval world stays distant, our shared listening creates a present moment of calm across distances. From there, The exploration continues by considering the first impressions upon entering such a space, where every detail from the arrangement of benches to the quality of the light might prompt quiet reflection on endurance. The premise extends to the idea that no single night would unfold identically, influenced by factors like the inn's location along a trade route or near a pilgrimage path, elements supported by scattered references in period documents, yet open to regional differences. As a modern visitor, the sensory contrasts alone could prove absorbing at first. The roughness of surfaces, the variable temperatures, the proximity of others, each one inviting further questions about personal limits. Would curiosity sustain you through the initial hours, or would the accumulation of unfamiliar elements begin to test patience sooner than expected? We ease into these considerations without haste, allowing the mind to linger on the possibilities rather than rushing toward conclusions. The medieval inn, in this framing, becomes a lens for appreciating how much our current environments shape expectations of rest and safety. One might imagine the gradual realization that basic needs require negotiation in ways that feel novel, sparking ongoing interest in how people of that time navigated similar moments, based on the evidence we have and the gaps that remain. This opening invites a lingering sense of inquiry, where each imagined detail adds texture without claiming completeness. The night ahead holds layers we'll touch upon gradually, from the initial welcome to the quieter stretches when activity slows. In the meantime, the simple act of wondering about endurance keeps the narrative gently alive, bridging the distance between eras through thoughtful speculation rather than definitive statements. Imagine stepping from that welcome into the uncertain stretch of road leading toward an inn, where the path itself becomes the first test of endurance. Medieval routes, pieced together from scattered charters and traveller accounts, often amounted to little more than packed earth or rutted tracks that shifted with every season, turning to clinging mud after rain or cracking under summer drought. One might wonder how a traveller, perhaps on foot or guiding a weary mount, would navigate these surfaces without the reassurance of maps or markers, relying instead on landmarks that could vanish in twilight or shift after a storm. The dangers multiply in possibility. Isolated stretches where brigands might lurk according to occasional court records, sudden floods washing away fords, or simply the slow erosion of footing that leaves ankles twisted and progress halted. Each of these elements invites quiet speculation rather than certainty, for regional differences and the incomplete nature of surviving documents leave room for variation in how severe any single journey might prove. As daylight slips away, the challenge of arriving after dark sharpens into focus. Without modern illumination, the world narrows to the faint glow of a carried lantern, or the unreliable gleam of stars, making distances deceptive and turns easy to miss. A traveller could imagine the growing weight of fatigue settling in, the mind circling questions of whether the inn still lies ahead or has already been passed in the gathering gloom. Getting lost here carries more than inconvenience. It opens possibilities of spending the night exposed to the elements, with only the thin protection of a cloak against dew or sudden chill. Historical hints suggest some routes featured occasional waystones or remembered trees, yet these offered imperfect guidance at best, prompting one to consider how anxiety might build with each uncertain step, testing resolve before the shelter even comes into view. Reaching the inn at last brings its own sequence of uncertainties. The structure might appear first as a low silhouette against the sky, its thatched roof perhaps sagging, or its walls of timber and wattle showing signs of a recent repair or neglect, depending on the locale and the innkeeper's resources. Finding the entrance requires circling the building in near darkness, perhaps guided by the muffled sound of voices or the faint scent of hearth smoke that drifts outward. Admission itself hinges on factors left open to interpretation, whether the door opens readily or requires persistent knocking, how the keeper assesses the newcomer's appearance or the number of companions, and whether space remains amid the press of earlier arrivals. Chronicles mention instances of inns turning travellers away when full, while other fragments suggest a more flexible approach tied to payment or reputation, leaving us to ponder the moment of hesitation at the threshold and the relief or disappointment that follows a welcome. Once inside the entrance, first impressions unfold through layers of sensory detail that differ markedly from modern expectations. The doorway might frame a rush of warmer air carrying traces of ale, stew, and unwashed travellers, while the floor underfoot feels uneven, packed with straw that shifts with each movement. Light from rushlights or a central fire casts long, flickering shadows across benches and tables, revealing an interior that could seem both welcoming in its activity and cramped in its shared boundaries. One could imagine pausing there, adjusting to the sudden proximity of strangers, whose conversations pause briefly before resuming, and noting how the building's construction, perhaps low beams requiring a duct head or walls that retain the day's damp, immediately signals a space shaped by necessity rather than comfort. These initial moments spark curiosity about endurance, as the contrast with solitary modern travel begins to register, without any claim that every inn matched this picture exactly. Extending this line of thought, the road's condition ties directly into the timing of arrival, for poor surfaces slow progress and increase the likelihood of entering after nightfall. A cartwheel caught in a rut or a horse lame from loose stones might delay departure from the previous stop, forcing a choice between pressing on or risking the open countryside. Speculation arises naturally here around how such setbacks accumulate, each one eroding the traveller's margin of safety and heightening awareness of vulnerability. Yet the very unpredictability also opens space for unexpected encounters, perhaps with fellow wayfarers who share directions or warnings drawn from their own recent passage, fragments of information that function like an informal network across routes mentioned in period letters and legal disputes. The act of locating the inn after dark further deepens the imaginative exercise. Without signposts or consistent lighting, success depends on memory of previous journeys, overheard descriptions, or simply following the faint glow that might indicate human habitation. Challenges multiply when weather intervenes, rain obscuring vision or wind carrying away any guiding sounds. Admission procedures, varying by establishment, could involve barter or coin exchange at the door, or a brief interrogation about one's origins and intentions, elements hinted at in surviving ordinances yet open to local custom. Through all of this, the building's exterior offers clues to its interior life. Smoke curling from a chimney suggests a fire still tended, while shuttered windows hint at an attempt to retain warmth, each detail inviting reflection on the practical decisions made by those who maintained such places. As these elements layer together, the transition from road to threshold becomes a gradual immersion rather than a sudden shift. The traveller might carry forward the chill of the evening air, the tension of uncertain footing, and the alertness required to watch for obstacles or figures ahead, all of which linger even after the door closes. This continuity underscores how the medieval night begins well before the inn itself, shaped by the journey's demands and the body's accumulating weariness. Questions linger about personal limits. How many such nights of uncertain travel would erode the novelty into strain, or whether the prospect of any shelter at all sustains the spirit through the final stretches. Records leave these outcomes open, varying with individual circumstance and the broad conditions of trade routes or pilgrimage paths that funneled people toward these waypoints. Considering the entrance more closely reveals further textures of possibility. The door itself, perhaps heavy oak reinforced with iron straps, swings inward to reveal not a lobby, but an immediate mingling of space where animals might share the ground floor, or where storage barrels line the walls. First impressions here encompass not only sight, but the subtle give of the floorboards, the echo of footsteps, and the way voices carry differently indoors than under open sky. Such details, drawn from archaeological traces and occasional illustrations, encourage ongoing curiosity about adaptation as the modern visitor mentally compares the threshold experience to the controlled environments left behind. The inn stands as one fragile node in a wider network of movement, its role dependent on factors like proximity to markets or the season's traffic, elements that historical sources suggest without fixing into uniformity. Through this progression along the road and into the building, the narrative of endurance gains depth from the accumulation of ordinary frictions rather than singular events. Each rut avoided or missed turn corrected adds to the mental tally, while the moment of admission marks a tentative success whose continuation remains uncertain until the night unfolds further. The style of reflection here mirrors the opening welcome, allowing the mind to dwell on contrasts and possibilities without rushing toward resolution, keeping the gentle inquiry alive as the scene settles inside the common room ahead. Once inside the common room, the transition from threshold to shared interior space unfolds as a gradual layering of impressions rather than any abrupt change, inviting the mind to linger on how the body and senses might adjust to an environment shaped by necessity and collective presence. The main hall itself often took the form of a single elongated space, perhaps with low timber beams supporting a thatched or tiled roof overhead, earthen or uneven plank floors scattered with fresh or stale rushes that released faint herbal scents when trodden upon, and a central hearth or sidewall fireplace serving as the focal point where flames flickered uncertainly, depending on the draught from doors or smoke holes that might or might not vent effectively. One could imagine the layout allowing for benches along the walls and rough tables arranged in loose clusters, creating pockets of activity where travellers might claim spots based on arrival order or the innkeeper's subtle guidance, while storage barrels, hanging provisions, or even tethered animals occupied corners that blurred the boundary between human lodging and practical workspace. Such arrangements spark curiosity about adaptability, for regional variations in construction, whether in stone-built regions or timber-framed ones, leave open the possibility that some halls felt more expansive on market days when extra pallets or seating appeared, while others remained perpetually cramped, prompting reflection on how a newcomer might navigate these boundaries without modern markers of personal territory. The atmosphere within quickly asserts itself through layers of smoke that curl from the hearth, carrying traces of damp wood, cooking residues, and accumulated grime that settle into clothing and hair, mingling with the dimness created by limited rushlights or tallow candles whose feeble glow barely penetrates the corners where shadows pool and shift with each movement of air. Sensory overwhelm emerges as a plausible companion here, as the eyes strain to discern faces across the gloom, while the nose registers overlapping odours of spilled ale, unwashed wool, animal hides, and perhaps the sharper notes of peat or charcoal smoke that could sting the throat or induce a persistent cough, all without any certainty that every establishment produced identical conditions, since fuel sources and ventilation practices varied widely according to local resources and seasonal demands. The darkness itself, punctuated only by moving flames, might encourage a narrowing of attention to immediate surroundings, fostering an imaginative exercise in how prolonged exposure could heighten awareness of subtle changes like a door opening to admit cooler air or a sudden flare from added logs, inviting speculation on whether such an environment tested the limits of endurance for those accustomed to solitary or better-lit travels. Amid this setting, the mix of travellers and locals forms a fluid assembly whose interactions remain open to interpretation, with merchants perhaps exchanging news of distant markets, pilgrims sharing route fragments drawn from recent journeys, and villagers or labourers pausing for refreshment after daily tasks, their conversations blending in accents and dialects that could range from familiar regional tones to entirely foreign ones depending on the inn's position along trade paths or pilgrimage routes. One might wonder how such gatherings evolved over the evening, as initial reserve gave way to tentative exchanges or even shared laughter. Yet the incomplete nature of surviving records leaves room for quieter possibilities as well, such as wary glances between strangers or small clusters forming around a familiar face, all while the innkeeper moved among them assessing needs without any fixed protocol preserved in documents. This diversity adds depth to the endurance narrative, encouraging curiosity about personal responses. Would the presence of varied company ease the isolation of the road or intensify a sense of displacement, particularly when languages overlapped imperfectly and gestures filled gaps in understanding? Noise levels compound the immersion, rising from overlapping voices that carry across the hall in waves of discussion, occasional bursts of song or argument, the clatter of tankards on tables, and the low background sounds of animals shifting or children playing in corners, creating an acoustic environment where individual conversations dissolve into a collective murmur that offers little opportunity for private reflection. Lack of privacy follows naturally from the open layout, as sleeping arrangements might already be visible in the form of benches or floor spaces claimed early, and personal belongings rest within easy view of others, prompting one to consider how such conditions might erode the boundaries of solitude that modern listeners take for granted. Historical hints from ordinances and traveller fragments suggest that inns sometimes attempted partitions or upper lofts for separation, yet these remained inconsistent enough to sustain speculation on whether any traveller could truly withdraw, or if the shared space instead fostered an unintended intimacy through proximity alone. Extending these observations, the sensory details accumulate without resolution, as smoke might drift persistently towards certain seating areas depending on wind direction outside, while the darkness conceals or reveals details at random intervals, such as a sudden glimpse of a scarred table surface, or the glint of a shared drinking vessel passed among companions. The mix of people invites further imaginative layering, with possibilities of a local farmer recounting weather patterns that affect travel, or a weary pilgrim displaying a relic that draws brief attention, each interaction threading through the noise without dominating it, and leaving open questions about how such moments might linger in memory or fade into the general hum. Privacy, or its absence, ties directly into these dynamics, for even a moment of quiet contemplation risks interruption by a passing figure or an overheard remark, encouraging reflection on resilience as the traveller adjusts expectations from solitary road thoughts to this communal reality. As the evening progresses within the hall, the atmosphere deepens through the interplay of these elements, with smoke thickening as more fuel is added and conversation swelling in volume after rounds of drink, yet always tempered by the underlying uncertainty of how long any individual might remain before seeking rest elsewhere in the building. One could imagine the floor underfoot growing more uneven in perceived texture as fatigue sets in, or the air growing heavier with accumulated warmth and odours, all of which prompt ongoing curiosity about adaptation without asserting uniformity across inns or regions. The lack of clear divisions between areas means that the same space, serving for eating and socializing, transitions seamlessly into preparation for sleep, with benches cleared or straw redistributed in ways hinted at but not fixed by period sources, sustaining the gentle inquiry into personal limits. Through such layering, the common room emerges not as a static backdrop, but as an active participant in the night's unfolding, its sensory and social textures inviting the mind to dwell on contrast with quieter modern spaces, while keeping the narrative of endurance alive for what lies ahead in the sleeping arrangements. This immersion continues to unfold through extended consideration of how the central fire serves multiple roles simultaneously, providing heat that radiates unevenly across the hall, while also acting as a gathering point where individuals might warm chilled hands or dry damp cloaks, creating focal clusters that shift as people move about the limited space. The smoke rising from it carries not only visual haze but also the potential for eye irritation or throat discomfort that varies with individual tolerance, inviting speculation on whether frequent travellers developed greater resilience or simply endured with varying degrees of success. Layout possibilities expand here to include side alcoves or raised platforms in some structures, perhaps used for storage or occasional private talks, yet their availability remains contingent on prior occupants and the innkeeper's discretion, adding another layer of uncertainty to navigation upon entry. Atmosphere builds further with the interplay of light and shadow that distorts distances, making the hall seem alternately larger or more confined depending on one's position relative to the flames, a perceptual shift that could heighten awareness of others' movements without any documented consistency in how such effects manifested across different establishments. The mix of occupants deepens into richer possibilities as the night advances, with locals perhaps departing earlier to return home while travellers linger in hopes of securing better positions, their conversations touching on topics like recent fairs, weather omens, or shared hardships in ways that blend information exchange with simple companionship. Noise persists as a constant undercurrent, ranging from the rhythmic scrape of benches being adjusted to the intermittent calls for service or bursts of communal activity like dice games or storytelling, each element contributing to an auditory tapestry where silence becomes a rare and fleeting occurrence. Lack of privacy manifests in the visibility of personal routines, such as the removal of outer layers or the arrangement of meagre belongings, all conducted within the collective gaze and prompting reflection on how such exposure might influence behaviour or inner composure. Further expansion reveals how these aspects interconnect without fixed outcomes, as smoke from the hearth might carry fragments of conversation across the room, or obscure gestures that would otherwise convey meaning, while darkness encourages closer leaning during talks and thereby intensifies the sense of shared space. The overall overwhelm invites the listener to consider cumulative effects over hours rather than isolated moments, with each new arrival or departure rippling through the existing patterns and sustaining curiosity about individual thresholds for tolerance. Regional differences in construction or custom continue to leave interpretive space, allowing for possibilities like better ventilated halls in windier locales or more boisterous gatherings near pilgrimage sites, all without resolving into certainty. Through this sustained exploration, the common room section maintains its reflective pace, bridging the arrival uncertainties with the deeper night ahead by emphasizing sensory and social textures that accumulate gradually, keeping the imaginative engagement alive as the narrative approaches the sleeping quarters. As the common room settles into its evening rhythms, the mind naturally drifts toward the question of where rest might finally claim the body, not as a separate chamber, but as an extension of the same shared space that has already absorbed so much of the day's movements and sounds. One could imagine the hall itself undergoing a subtle transformation, with benches shifted aside or straw redistributed across the earthen floor to form makeshift sleeping areas, their outlines emerging gradually as figures begin to claim positions without any formal announcement or recorded procedure to guide the process. This communal arrangement invites speculation on how the transition unfolds, perhaps with early arrivals securing spots nearest the hearth, where residual warmth lingers longest, while later comers accept places closer to the draughty door or in the cooler shadows along the walls, leaving open the possibility that such patterns reflect not rigid rules, but the quiet negotiations of fatigue and familiarity among strangers who must now share the night in close proximity. The sleeping surfaces themselves often took the form of straw pallets scattered directly upon the rushes or uneven planks, offering little more than a thin barrier between the body and the floor's persistent chill or irregularities, a detail that encourages reflection on how the texture might shift under shifting weight as the hours pass. These pallets, sometimes little more than loose bundles of fresh or reused straw, could be shared among multiple travellers, with 2 or even 3 individuals arranged side by side in a single narrow space, their cloaks or outer garments serving as the only coverings when dedicated bedding proved scarce, or reserved for the innkeeper's own use. The absence of personal space emerges here as a tangible condition, rather than an abstract idea, as elbows might brush against unknown shoulders during the settling process, and the faint rustle of straw under movement reminds each occupant of how little separates one from the next, prompting curiosity about whether such closeness fostered an odd sense of collective endurance or simply amplified the awareness of every breath and sigh nearby. Hierarchy among the spots adds another layer of interpretive possibility, with positions by the fire potentially claimed by those who arrived first or carried an air of greater means, perhaps merchants whose bundles of goods lent them subtle leverage in negotiations with the innkeeper, while labourers or pilgrims accepted the periphery where draughts from smoke holes or gaps in the thatch might stir the air more noticeably throughout the night. One might wonder how these unspoken rankings played out in practice, as the central areas offered not only warmth, but also a measure of visibility that could deter petty thefts, whereas the outer edges blended into deeper gloom and allowed for quieter withdrawal, though without any certainty that every establishment observed the same distinctions since local customs, and the size of the hall itself varied widely from region to region. The lack of individual bedding compounds this arrangement, as many travellers relied solely on the garments they wore, perhaps folding a cloak beneath the head or drawing it over the shoulders against the cooling air, leaving open questions about how the body adapts when no mattress intervenes between skin and the rough, sometimes damp straw that releases its own faint earthy scent with each adjustment. Shared beds introduce further dimensions to consider, with some accounts hinting at larger pallets or even raised platforms where groups clustered together for mutual warmth, their limbs occasionally overlapping in sleep despite any initial intentions to maintain distance, a scenario that sparks imaginative inquiry into the boundaries of privacy dissolving under the weight of necessity. The straw itself might compress unevenly over time, creating hollows that trap moisture from the floor or from the breath of those resting upon it, inviting speculation on whether frequent travellers developed habits of positioning themselves strategically to minimize such discomforts, or simply accepted the cumulative effects as part of the journey's rhythm. Personal space remains conspicuously absent in these configurations, as belongings rest within arm's reach, yet remain vulnerable to the movements of others, and the very act of turning over risks disturbing a neighbour whose own straw pallet lies only inches away, encouraging reflection on resilience as the night stretches onward without the modern luxury of solitary retreat. Regional variations sustain the sense of uncertainty here, for in timber-framed halls of one area the pallets might occupy lofts reached by narrow ladders, granting a slight elevation above the main floor's traffic, yet still shared among several occupants, while stone-built inns elsewhere kept everything at ground level, where the hierarchy favoured proximity to the hearth over any vertical separation. The hierarchy of sleeping spots thus extends beyond mere location to include subtle markers such as access to a shared blanket if one existed at all, or the relative quiet of a corner shielded from the last embers of conversation, all without fixed documentation to confirm consistency across establishments. As figures arrange themselves, the air grows heavier with the mingled warmth of bodies, the straw releasing its herbal notes anew under pressure, and the overall arrangement prompts ongoing curiosity about how such conditions might test the limits of endurance, blending the sensory textures of the earlier evening with the deeper vulnerability of sleep itself. Further layering reveals how the lack of dedicated bedding influences the entire experience. with some travellers perhaps improvising by rolling spare garments into makeshift pillows, while others lie flat against the pallet's uneven surface, the straw occasionally poking through thin fabric to create minor irritations that accumulate without resolution. Shared beds heighten this intimacy of circumstance, as strangers whose faces were barely distinguishable in the dim light now lie aligned in parallel rows, their breathing patterns gradually synchronizing or diverging in ways that invite speculation on the psychological effects of enforced proximity during hours when vigilance might otherwise remain alert. The hierarchy persists in these moments, with better rested individuals perhaps securing the inner positions away from doorways where late arrivals or early departures create disturbances, while those on the edges contend with cooler currents of air that filter through the structure, leaving interpretive space for how such placements affect the quality of rest across different nights or seasons. The communal nature of the arrangements deepens the reflective quality, as the same space that hosted meals and conversations now hosts the vulnerable state of sleep, with pallets laid out in loose formations that allow for the passage of the innkeeper or a restless occupant without clear pathways, thereby sustaining the sense of fluid boundaries. Straw pallets offer minimal cushioning, their contents shifting under the weight of multiple bodies and potentially harbouring remnants from previous users, a possibility that encourages gentle inquiry into adaptation without asserting any uniform standard. Lack of personal space manifests in the inability to stretch fully without contact, the edges of one pallet abutting the next so that movements transmit directly, prompting consideration of how travellers might navigate these constraints through small accommodations like angling the body or drawing limbs inward. Hierarchy of spots ties into these elements by suggesting that early claimers enjoy marginally better conditions, such as a thicker layer of straw or a position less exposed to the settling smoke that lingers near the ceiling. Yet even these advantages remain contingent on the inn's layout and the number of occupants that particular evening. One could imagine the gradual settling process, with conversations tapering as figures recline, the straw rustling in waves that mirror the earlier noise of voices, and the overall environment inviting speculation on whether the shared warmth compensates for the absence of individual comfort or simply underscores the collective nature of medieval travel. Through such sustained exploration, the sleeping arrangements bridge the social textures of the common room with the uncertainties of the night ahead, maintaining an imaginative engagement that lingers on possibilities rather than certainties as the body prepares for whatever rest the straw and proximity might allow. Extending these observations further, the transition to sleep might involve subtle repositioning of pallets to avoid the central traffic paths, creating clusters where groups of travellers from similar regions align together for unspoken reassurance, while solitary figures occupy the margins where isolation within the communal setting becomes most pronounced. The straw's texture varies in density depending on how recently it was replenished, sometimes offering a springy give that yields to the contours of the body and at other times compressing into a firm, unyielding mat that transmits every flaw imperfection upward, inviting curiosity about how such differences influence the onset of drowsiness. Shared beds with strangers introduce additional variables, as an accidental brush of fabric or a murmured word in half-sleep could momentarily bridge the gap between unknown lives, yet without any documented etiquette to govern these encounters, the outcome remains open to interpretation. Lack of bedding accentuates the rawness of the setup, with many relying on nothing beyond their travelling cloaks for insulation against the night's cooling, the material perhaps still carrying the damp of the road or the smoke of the hearth, layering additional sensory notes onto the already complex atmosphere. The hierarchy of sleeping spots continues to assert itself through practical considerations, such as the relative safety of positions near the innkeeper's own quarters if such existed, or the exposure of floor areas directly beneath smoke holes where rain might occasionally penetrate, all of which sustain speculation on the adaptive strategies travellers might employ. As the arrangement solidifies, the communal aspect fosters a quiet interdependence, with the collective warmth of bodies potentially offsetting the thinness of individual pallets, though the absence of personal space ensures that any disturbance propagates through the group in ripples of movement and sound. This configuration prompts deeper reflection on endurance, as the straw pallets and shared configurations challenge modern assumptions of solitary rest, encouraging the listener to consider how the hierarchy might shift with the arrival of new guests or the departure of early risers, leaving the space in a state of perpetual adjustment. Regional differences in construction allow for possibilities like raised benches serving as secondary sleeping platforms in some halls, granting slight elevation yet still shared among multiple occupants, while ground-level arrangements dominate elsewhere and emphasize the floor's direct connection to the Earth's chill. Through continued layering, the section on where one sleeps maintains its reflective pace, connecting the earlier sensory immersion with the vulnerabilities of night without resolving into fixed descriptions, thereby keeping the imaginative thread alive as the narrative moves toward the uninvited presences that might accompany such arrangements. The straw itself becomes a focal point for ongoing inquiry, its fresh or stale qualities affecting not only comfort but also the subtle odours that rise when disturbed, mingling with the residual smoke and body warmth to create an environment that evolves continuously through the hours. Shared beds with strangers heighten the sense of collective fate, as the limited space requires a form of unspoken coordination in turning or settling, fostering speculation on whether such proximity erodes barriers or reinforces an inner reserve. Lack of personal space extends to the visual field, with sleeping forms visible to any who remain awake, their outlines softened by the dying firelight yet still present as reminders of the shared condition. Hierarchy of spots, meanwhile, might favour those who can negotiate a spot near stored provisions or away from animal tethering areas, adding practical dimensions to the social ordering without any overarching certainty. In this way, the sleeping arrangements unfold as a gradual deepening of the common room's textures, the pallets laid out in patterns that reflect both arrival order and unspoken status, the straw providing minimal yet essential separation from the floor, and the proximity of strangers inviting continuous reflection on the boundaries of comfort and solitude. The absence of dedicated bedding leaves each traveller to improvise with available garments, the hierarchy determining access to marginally better positions, and the overall setup sustaining curiosity about how such nights shape the experience of travel across uncertain historical landscapes. As these elements interweave without fixed resolution, the narrative preserves its gentle momentum toward the deeper uncertainties of the night, building upon the straw pallets and their uneven compressions under the weight of shared bodies. One might begin to sense how these arrangements open pathways for presences that require no invitation, yet arrive with every traveller and every reused bundle of bedding. The very materials that offer a thin separation from the floor's chill or irregularities also create sheltered environments where smaller creatures find warmth and sustenance without effort, prompting reflection on how the absence of personal space extends beyond human proximity to include these unchosen companions that move freely among the layers of straw and fabric. Fleas, in particular, could thrive in such conditions, their presence tied to the residual warmth from multiple occupants and the organic matter embedded in reused straw, though without any certainty that every pallet carried them in equal measure, since local practices of replenishment varied widely, and the frequency of cleaning remained undocumented across regions. One could imagine the subtle sensations accumulating as the night deepens, perhaps a faint irritation along the skin that defies clear attribution, inviting speculation on whether travellers developed an instinctive awareness of these movements, or simply absorbed them into the broader tapestry of discomfort that already included shifting straw and neighbouring breaths. Lice present another layer of possibility here, clinging to garments that serve as both covering and pillow, transferring easily in the close quarters where elbows brush and cloaks overlap during the settling process. Their persistence encouraged by the lack of dedicated laundering facilities and the shared nature of even the thinnest bedding. This transmission through proximity sparks curiosity about the psychological adjustments travellers might make, perhaps growing accustomed to the knowledge that such creatures accompanied most journeys, yet without any recorded sense of alarm that would distinguish one night from another. Bedbugs add further dimensions to consider, potentially emerging from cracks in wooden platforms or the seams of reused pallets, drawn to the body heat that lingers even as the hearth cools, their activity unfolding in patterns that align with the hours when movement subsides and the hall settles into quieter rhythms. The communal layout ensures that any infestation in one area spreads readily to adjacent spots, as the narrow gaps between pallets allow passage without obstruction, leaving open interpretive space for how this interconnectedness might amplify the sense of collective vulnerability rather than isolating it to individual sleepers. Rats and mice enter this picture as larger yet equally uninvited presences, drawn by remnants of the evening's meals scattered across the rushes or tucked into corners where travellers set down their bundles, their nocturnal explorations facilitated by the same earthen floor and shadowed peripheries that already define the hierarchy of sleeping positions. One might wonder how these creatures navigate the space without disturbing the fragile equilibrium of rest, perhaps skirting the edges where drafts from doorways create cooler zones less favoured by human occupants, or venturing nearer the hearth when residual crumbs from shared trenches provide easy foraging. The straw itself offers both cover and nesting material, its loose bundles potentially harbouring small burrows that go unnoticed until a sudden rustle or the faint patter of feet transmits through the thin layering, prompting speculation on whether such sounds blend into the general background of size and shifts or stand out as distinct reminders of the inn's porous boundaries with the natural world. Impossibility of avoidance emerges here as a central condition, rooted in the absence of sealed storage or separate chambers, where even the most cautious placement of belongings cannot fully insulate against creatures that move through walls, floors, and the very air gaps in thatch or timber. Medieval attitudes toward these companions invite gentle inquiry rather than fixed conclusions, as some accounts hint at a pragmatic tolerance born of familiarity, viewing fleas and lice as inevitable aspects of travel, much like dust on the road or smoke in the hall, while others suggest attempts at mitigation through herbs scattered among the straw or smoke from certain woods that might discourage activity without guaranteeing success. Such attitudes could vary by region and social standing, with those claiming better positions near stored provisions, perhaps gaining slight advantages in deterring mice through proximity to the innkeeper's own vigilance, whereas peripheral sleepers accept a fuller share of these encounters as part of their marginal placement. The shared warmth that offsets the thinness of pallets also sustains these creatures, creating microclimates where body heat and organic debris support cycles of activity that align with human rest periods, encouraging reflection on how this interdependence might shape the overall experience of the night without any modern expectation of isolation. One could imagine the gradual accumulation of awareness as hours pass, with initial sensations giving way to a resigned integration into the sensory landscape already filled with straw scents and neighbouring movements, the vermin becoming extensions of the communal arrangement rather than disruptions to it. Rats, larger and potentially bolder, might test these boundaries more noticeably, their presence linked to the inn's role as a nexus for food and waste, yet without documented patterns that confirm consistent behaviour across establishments or seasons. This layering of uninvited elements deepens the reflective quality of the sleeping space, as the same straw that compresses unevenly now carries traces of prior inhabitants in ways that extend to microscopic scales, inviting ongoing curiosity about adaptation and endurance. Travellers perhaps position themselves strategically to minimize contact, angling bodies away from known drafts or clustering nearer groups from familiar regions. Yet the impossibility of complete separation persists through the interconnected palettes and open layouts that allow free movement for all. Medieval responses to these creatures might include folk practices passed along routes, such as the use of certain plants or the timing of arrivals to coincide with fresher bedding, though these remain possibilities rather than certainties, varying with individual knowledge and the resources available at each stop. The hierarchy of spots continues to influence exposure here, with central positions potentially offering marginal protection through greater visibility or residual hearth activity that could discourage some rodents, while outer areas blend into the gloom where smaller creatures operate with less interference. Extending these observations, the presence of lice and fleas ties directly into the reuse of garments and cloaks, their eggs or adults transferring during the brief interactions of settling or turning, a process that underscores the fluid boundaries between personal items and the shared environment. One might consider how such transfers accumulate over multiple nights on the road, building a traveller's own portable ecosystem that merges with each new inn's offerings, prompting speculation on whether this merging fostered a form of resilience or simply compounded the layers of sensation already present. Mice, more elusive than rats, could exploit the narrow spaces between bodies and straw edges, their quiet foraging adding subtle textures to the auditory backdrop without necessarily awakening those already attuned to the rhythms of collective breathing. Attitudes toward these animals in medieval contexts encourage further layering of interpretation, as they appear in stories and observations not always as threats, but as markers of the inn's lively untamed character, integrated into the daily and nightly flow rather than isolated as problems requiring systematic eradication. The impossibility of avoidance thus becomes a thread that weaves through the entire arrangement, from the straw's organic composition to the proximity that facilitates transfer, sustaining a continuous engagement with the uncertainties of rest in such spaces. Regional differences sustain this sense of openness, for in areas where stone construction predominates, the cooler surfaces might alter creature activity patterns compared to timber halls, where warmth lingers more readily in the wood itself, yet without overarching documentation to fix these variations into consistent rules. As the night progresses, these uninvited bedfellows contribute to the evolving atmosphere, their movements potentially synchronized with the settling of smoke or the cooling of air, inviting reflection on how the body and mind navigate an environment where human and non-human elements coexist in unbroken continuity. Further dimensions emerge when considering how food remnants from the common room transition seamlessly into the sleeping phase, attracting rodents whose paths cross those of fleas and bedbugs in the same straw matrix, creating an interconnected web of activity that defies separation. Travellers might respond with small gestures of accommodation, such as folding cloaks more tightly or shifting slightly to discourage direct contact, though these adjustments remain speculative adaptations within the larger framework of necessity and shared circumstance. Medieval attitudes, explored through surviving hints rather than definitive records, suggest a spectrum from casual acceptance to occasional remedies like scattering ash or using aromatic bundles, each carrying possibilities of partial effect without assurance of elimination, thereby maintaining the imaginative inquiry into how such nights tested limits of tolerance. The hierarchy persists in these interactions, as those with access to marginally thicker straw or positions away from wall crevices encounter fewer immediate reminders, while others integrate the full range into their experience, all within the fluid negotiations that define the hall's transformation from day to night. Through sustained exploration, the uninvited bedfellows extend the reflective momentum from the sleeping arrangements, connecting the tangible textures of straw and proximity with the subtler presences that populate the same space, preserving curiosity about endurance across uncertain historical landscapes without resolving into fixed outcomes. This configuration prompts deeper consideration of how the collective warmth and organic materials sustain a miniature ecosystem, where fleas cycle through stages of activity alongside human rest, lice transfer via shared fabrics, and rodents navigate the peripheries, each element adding to the layered sensory and psychological experience that bridges the evening's social textures with the vulnerabilities of sleep. Regional variations allow for interpretive possibilities, such as inns near grain stores experiencing heightened rodent activity, or those in damper climates fostering more persistent insect presence, all without certainty that any single pattern held universally. As these presences interweave with the earlier elements of hierarchy, lack of bedding and communal closeness, the narrative sustains its gentle momentum, encouraging ongoing reflection on the boundaries between comfort and the natural intrusions that define the medieval night. As the uninvited presences of fleas, lice, bedbugs, and rodents weave through the straw and remnants from prior gatherings, attention turns naturally toward the evening meal that precedes the settling into pallets, for those scattered crumbs and overlooked morsels originate in the shared trenchers and bowls that define dining at the inn. One might imagine travellers arriving weary from the road, their anticipation tempered by the knowledge that sustenance here emerges from whatever provisions the innkeepers manage to secure that day. Perhaps a thick pottage simmered over the hearth with root vegetables, grains, and occasional scraps of meat or fish, depending on the season and the proximity of markets or farms. Without any certainty that every establishment followed identical patterns, local practices suggest variations where coastal inns might incorporate dried fish or shellfish, while inland ones rely more heavily on cabbage, onions, or barley, each combination reflecting the unpredictable flow of goods along trade routes, rather than a standardized menu that could be anticipated in advance. The quality of these ingredients invites further speculation, as one could envision produce carried over distances without reliable preservation methods, potentially arriving wilted or partially spoiled yet still incorporated into the pot to stretch resources across multiple guests. Safety remains an open question here, since contamination from unclean water used in preparation or from storage in damp corners could introduce risks that travellers weighed against the simple necessity of nourishment after a day of travel, though without documented consistency across regions or seasons that would allow firm conclusions about how often such meals proved nourishing rather than merely filling. In some possibilities, herbs gathered from nearby fields might mask off flavours or lend a measure of deterrence against spoilage, while in others the reliance on salted or smoked elements hints at attempts to extend usability, each approach carrying its own uncertainties tied to the skill of the preparer and the availability of those additives. Dining itself unfolds without the separation of personal plates or utensils that later eras might assume as standard, prompting reflection on how a single trencher of coarse bread might serve as both platter and edible base for portions ladled from a communal pot, with fingers or shared knives transferring morsels amid the press of bodies around the table. One might consider the tactile intimacy this arrangement fosters, where elbows brush and portions are negotiated through glances or brief words rather than individual servings, extending the same lack of personal boundaries already encountered in sleeping arrangements into the realm of nourishment, and creating an unbroken continuity of shared exposure. The absence of forks or spoons, for instance, means that the texture of the pottage, sometimes thin enough to drink directly from the bowl, at other times thickened to a consistency that clings, becomes part of the sensory experience, inviting speculation on whether travellers adapted by favouring certain seating positions that allowed easier access, or whether the hierarchy of places near the hearth influenced not only warmth, but also the order in which servings were distributed. Instead of water, which carried its own uncertainties regarding purity from local wells or streams, the ale poured from pitchers offers an alternative that one could imagine varying widely in strength and clarity. From weaker brews suitable for quenching thirst throughout the meal to stronger varieties that might dull the edges of fatigue, yet introduce their own variables of fermentation quality. Regional differences sustain this openness, as inns in areas with established brewing traditions perhaps draw from more consistent supplies, while those along less travelled routes rely on whatever batch the innkeeper has recently completed, each possibility leaving interpretive space for how the drink's cloudiness or bitterness might signal freshness or, conversely, an extended storage that alters its character without guaranteeing uniformity. The choice of ale over water thus threads into the broader atmosphere of the meal, potentially encouraging slower sips amid conversation, or simply serving as the default that aligns with customary practices, though without any overarching assurance that it mitigated all concerns about hydration or digestion in the same way for every traveller. Building upon these elements, the communal nature of the meal extends the reflective momentum from the uninvited bedfellows by linking the food remnants directly to the later nocturnal activity, as overlooked bits of bread or vegetable matter transition seamlessly from trenches to the rushes beneath, sustaining the miniature ecosystem already populated by creatures navigating the same spaces. One could imagine the gradual accumulation of awareness during the meal itself, where the press of fellow diners and the flickering light from the hearth create an environment in which tastes and textures blend with the ambient sounds of chewing and low talk, prompting speculation on whether individuals developed preferences for certain portions, or simply accepted what was available as part of the fluid negotiations that define an inn's evening rhythm. Quality concerns might surface subtly here, perhaps through the occasional tougher piece of meat or the variable saltiness of the pottage, each instance inviting quiet assessment rather than outright rejection, since alternatives remain limited and the cost of lodging often bundles such provisions together. Safety of ingredients, meanwhile, opens pathways for further inquiry without resolution, as the possibility of sourcing from multiple suppliers, some local and fresh, others carried from farther afield, creates a mosaic of potential benefits and drawbacks that depend on factors like recent weather affecting harvests, or the reliability of preservation techniques such as smoking or pickling. In damper climates, for example, the risk of mould or fermentation accelerating unexpectedly could alter the meal's character in ways that travellers might notice through smell or consistency, yet without records fixing these variations into predictable patterns, the experience retains its speculative quality. Dining without personal plates reinforces this interconnectedness, as the shared trencher absorbs juices and fragments that later attract the very rodents whose paths cross those of insects in the straw, forming an unbroken chain from the table to the sleeping area that underscores the porous boundaries of the inn environment. The ale, consumed in place of water, adds another layer where possibilities multiply, its production from malted grains and hops potentially varying not only by recipe but also by the water source used in brewing, which itself might differ from the drinking water available at the inn, and thereby introduce distinct qualities of clarity or strength. One might wonder how this substitution influences the overall meal, perhaps fostering a mild conviviality among strangers, or simply serving as a practical measure that aligns with prevailing customs. Each interpretation remaining open, since attitudes toward its consumption could range from routine acceptance to occasional preference for weaker dilutions depending on the time of year or the traveller's tolerance. As portions diminish and trenches are cleared or repurposed, the transition towards sleep preparations begins to overlap, with any remaining scraps contributing to the organic debris that supports the uninvited presences already explored, thereby sustaining curiosity about how the evening's nourishment shapes both immediate satisfaction and the subsequent hours of rest. Regional practices further enrich these considerations, as inns in grain-producing areas might offer more consistent bread alongside the pottage, while those near livestock routes incorporate occasional dairy elements or tougher cuts, each difference inviting reflection on how such availability influences the hierarchy of seating or the pace at which diners engage with their portions. Without utensils, the act of eating becomes a matter of manual dexterity and social awareness, where reaching across the table or waiting for a neighbour to finish a bite becomes part of the unspoken etiquette that maintains equilibrium amid limited space. The ale's role in this setting could similarly vary, perhaps poured more freely in establishments with ample stores or rationed in others to stretch supplies, prompting speculation on whether its presence mitigates the uncertainties of ingredient quality by providing a familiar taste amid variable dishes. This layering of meal elements deepens the overall atmosphere, connecting the tangible aspects of shared food and drink to the psychological adjustments travellers might make when confronting the absence of personal boundaries, from the trench's communal surface to the ale's collective pitcher. One could envision the meal concluding with a gradual dispersal toward the palates, the lingering sense of cooked grains and fermented brew mingling with the straw's organic notes, and thereby reinforcing the continuous engagement with an environment where nourishment and rest share the same uncertain foundations. Possibilities for mitigation, such as travellers carrying their own small knives for portioning or selecting seats that offer marginally better access, remain speculative adaptations within the larger framework of necessity, varying with individual resources and the specific conditions encountered at each stop. As these dining dynamics interweave with the earlier elements of hierarchy, proximity, and creature activity, the narrative sustains its gentle momentum, encouraging ongoing reflection on the boundaries between sustenance and the natural intrusions that define the medieval night without resolving into fixed outcomes. Extending these observations, the safety of ingredients ties directly into the broader uncertainties of travel, where the inn's role as a nexus for both people and provisions means that any given pottage might incorporate elements from diverse origins, each carrying its own potential for variation in freshness or preparation that defies generalization across establishments. The lack of personal plates, in turn, amplifies the sense of collective participation, as the trench's absorption of flavours from multiple hands creates a shared taste profile that mirrors the interconnected sleeping arrangements, with remnants serving as bridges to the nocturnal ecosystem already populated by fleas and rodents. Ale, as the primary beverage, invites consideration of its own production variables, from the duration of fermentation to the quality of barrels used for storage, each factor opening interpretive space for how it might complement or contrast with the meal's textures in ways that influence digestion or comfort during the night ahead. Regional differences, such as stronger brews in colder climates to offset chill or lighter ones in warmer areas, sustain this openness without certainty that any single pattern held universally, allowing the experience to retain its layered, reflective quality. Through sustained exploration, the dinner at the inn thus extends the reflective momentum from the uninvited bedfellows, linking the evening's shared provisions to the vulnerabilities of sleep via the very remnants that attract additional presences into the straw matrix. Travellers perhaps position themselves strategically during the meal to minimize later discomfort, angling toward fresher portions or clusters of familiar faces, yet the impossibility of complete separation persists through the communal layout and open preparations that allow free movement for all elements, human and otherwise. Medieval responses to these dining conditions might include folk practices passed along routes, such as the preference for certain inns known for more reliable ale or the timing of arrivals to coincide with fresher batches, though these remain possibilities rather than certainties, varying with individual knowledge and the resources available at each stop. The hierarchy of spots continues to influence exposure here, with central positions near the hearth, potentially offering marginal advantages in warmth and serving order, while outer areas blend into the periphery where variable ingredients and shared access define a fuller share of the uncertainties. As the meal winds down and the hall prepares for its transformation into sleeping quarters, these elements contribute to the evolving atmosphere, their combined textures of taste, scent, and social negotiation potentially synchronized with the cooling of the pottage pot or the settling of ale dregs, inviting reflection on how the body and mind navigate an environment where nourishment and rest coexist in unbroken continuity. Further dimensions emerge when considering how the absence of utensils shapes not only the physical act of eating, but also the psychological integration into the group, where the shared trencher becomes an extension of the same proximity that facilitates the transfer of lice or the foraging of mice, creating an interconnected web that defies separation between day and night activities. Attitudes toward the ale, explored through surviving hints rather than definitive records, suggest a spectrum from casual reliance to occasional wariness regarding its strength, each carrying possibilities of partial adaptation without assurance of uniform effect, thereby maintaining the imaginative inquiry into how such evenings tested limits of endurance across uncertain historical landscapes. This configuration prompts deeper consideration of how the communal meal sustains a miniature social and sensory ecosystem, where pottage ingredients cycle through preparation and consumption alongside the ale's fermentation, all within the fluid negotiations that bridge the common room's daytime functions with the vulnerabilities of the night. Regional variations allow for interpretive possibilities, such as inns in fertile valleys experiencing greater ingredient diversity, or those in remote areas relying on preserved staples, all without certainty that any single pattern held universally. As these dining aspects interweave with the earlier elements of shared straw, uninvited presences, and collective warmth, the narrative sustains its gentle momentum, encouraging ongoing reflection on the boundaries between sustenance and the natural intrusions that define the medieval night. As the remnants of the shared trencher settle into the rushes and the final draughts of ale linger in their pitchers, the natural progression of the evening draws attention toward the less discussed necessities that follow any meal, where the absence of dedicated bathroom facilities leaves travellers navigating their bodily needs within the same confined spaces already occupied by the communal straw and the creatures drawn to its debris. One might consider how this lack of separation prompts immediate speculation on the practical arrangements that must have unfolded, perhaps through the discreet positioning of chamber pots near the pallets, or in corners shielded only by the press of bodies and the dimming hearth light, inviting reflection on whether such vessels were provided by the innkeeper as part of the bundled lodging, or whether guests carried their own modest containers as a customary precaution shaped by prior experiences along the route. The disposal of these pots, in turn, opens pathways for further inquiry without resolution, as possibilities range from emptying them into nearby streams or designated pits under cover of darkness, to simply contributing their contents to the accumulating waste that layered the yard outside, each approach carrying uncertainties tied to the time of night, the weather, and the willingness of weary individuals to venture beyond the hall's relative shelter, amid the very dangers explored in later hours. This arrangement sustains the porous boundaries already encountered during dinner, where the same fingers that conveyed morsels from the pottage now handle matters of relief in close proximity to neighbours, fostering an unbroken continuity of shared exposure that extends the tactile intimacy of the meal into the realm of personal necessities and thereby deepens the miniature ecosystem sustained by organic matter, transitioning from table to floor. One could envision the gradual awareness during these moments, with the flickering remnants of firelight revealing the outlines of pots being passed or positioned, prompting quiet negotiations through glances rather than words to maintain some semblance of privacy within the collective space, though without any documented consistency that would allow firm conclusions about how frequently such considerations influence the choice of sleeping spots or the timing of retirements. The smell that permeated everything emerges here as a central element, inviting ongoing reflection, building from the mingled scents of cooked grains, fermented brew, and straw already noted at the meal's conclusion to encompass the sharper, more insistent notes arising from waste that might linger in the rushes or seep into the very walls, creating an atmosphere where olfactory layers accumulate across the night, without predictable patterns varying by region, season, or the particular habits of each establishment. Hygiene practices of the era add another dimension to these considerations, where the absence of routine washing facilities suggests possibilities such as a single basin of water, shared among multiple guests for cursory rinses of hands or faces, potentially drawn from the same uncertain sources that supplied the ale, and thereby introducing variables of cleanliness that travellers might assess through subtle cues like clarity or odour before committing to use. One might imagine how these limited practices intersect with the earlier elements of proximity and creature activity, as unwashed skin and clothing provide additional pathways for the transfer of fleas or lice already navigating the straw matrix, sustaining the interconnected web that defies separation between nourishment, rest, and bodily maintenance. Speculation arises naturally on whether individuals adapted by reserving small portions of ale for wiping rather than drinking, or by favouring positions near doors for occasional access to external water sources, adaptations that remain interpretive possibilities dependent on personal resources and the specific conditions at each stop, rather than uniform customs holding across all inns. Regional differences sustain this openness, as establishments in areas with abundant streams might allow for more frequent emptying of chamber pots into flowing water that could carry waste away more readily, while those in drier or more isolated locales rely on slower accumulation in pits that heighten the pervasive odours threading through the common room. The smell, in this light, becomes not merely an inconvenience but a sensory thread linking the dinner's variable ingredients, potentially wilted or partially spoiled, to the later nocturnal hours, where it mingles with the warmth from bodies and the cooling of the hearth to form an environment that tests the limits of adaptation without offering assurances of mitigation through herbs or ventilation. One could consider the psychological adjustments travellers might make when confronting these realities, perhaps developing a heightened tolerance through repeated journeys, or selecting inns reputed for slightly better arrangements based on word of mouth passed along trade routes, though such preferences stay speculative without certainty that any single pattern prevailed universally. Further dimensions emerge when connecting these sanitation elements directly to the uninvited bedfellows already explored, as the organic contributions from chamber pots and food remnants alike nourish the miniature ecosystem in the rushes, encouraging the foraging of rodents and insects whose paths cross those of human occupants in the shared darkness. Possibilities for partial relief, such as stepping outside briefly despite the risks or using corners designated by custom rather than formal facilities, invite reflection on how these choices influence the overall flow of the night, potentially synchronizing with the settling of ale dregs or the dispersal of diners toward pallets in ways that maintain the gentle momentum of uncertainty. Hygiene routines, meanwhile, open interpretive space around the use of cloths or natural abrasives for basic cleansing, practices that might vary with the availability of materials gathered from nearby fields, and thereby tie into the same folk knowledge that could influence choices of seating during the meal or positions for sleep. The absence of bathroom facilities thus reinforces the collective participation already evident in the trencher and straw, where the lack of personal separation amplifies the sense of an environment in which every necessity, from eating to relief, unfolds amid the same porous boundaries that allow free movement for all elements. One might wonder how this configuration shapes the transition toward the people around you in the subsequent hours, as the shared handling of chamber pots and the lingering smells foster a familiarity born of necessity rather than choice, prompting speculation on whether such intimacy eases or complicates the social negotiations that define the medieval night. Regional practices further enrich these layers, with inns near markets perhaps benefiting from more regular waste removal by local labourers, while remote stops accumulate debris over longer periods, each difference sustaining curiosity about the variables that travellers wade without resolution into fixed outcomes. As these considerations interweave with the earlier dynamics of shared provisions and creature activity, the narrative maintains its reflective quality, encouraging ongoing inquiry into how the necessities of sanitation extend the vulnerabilities of the evening into the vulnerabilities of rest. The pervasive smell, for instance, might subtly influence digestion or comfort in ways that connect back to the ale's fermentation variables and the pottage's ingredient mosaic, creating a holistic sensory experience that defies isolation of any single aspect. Hygiene practices, explored through the lens of possibility rather than certainty, suggest a spectrum from occasional basin use to reliance on the natural drying effects of air and straw, each carrying potential benefits or drawbacks tied to climate and individual constitution. This configuration prompts deeper consideration of the inn as a nexus where human needs cycle continuously through preparation, consumption, relief, and accumulation, all within the fluid boundaries that bridge the common room's functions with the uncertainties of the night ahead. Through sustained exploration, the sanitation and necessities at the inn thus extend the reflective momentum from dinner, linking the evening's shared elements to the vulnerabilities of sleep via the very wastes and odours that sustain the nocturnal ecosystem. Travellers perhaps position their chamber pots strategically to minimise later disturbance, angling toward less trafficked corners or clusters that offered marginal privacy. Yet the impossibility of complete separation persists through the communal layout and open preparations that allow free movement for all, human and otherwise. Attitudes toward these conditions, drawn from surviving hints rather than definitive records, suggest a range from routine acceptance to occasional wariness regarding the accumulating smells, each interpretation remaining open, since factors like the strength of the ale or the timing of arrivals could alter perceptions without guaranteeing uniformity. As portions of the night progress and the hall settles further, these elements contribute to the evolving atmosphere, their combined textures of scent and necessity potentially synchronized with the cooling of the space or the stirring of uninvited presences, inviting continued reflection on how the body navigates an environment where every function shares the same uncertain foundations. Regional variations allow for additional interpretive possibilities, such as inns in fertile areas experiencing more consistent access to cleansing water, or those along trade routes incorporating occasional travellers' own hygiene items, all without assurance that any single pattern held universally. This layering deepens the overall engagement, connecting the tangible aspects of waste disposal and limited washing to the psychological adjustments that sustain curiosity about the medieval night's full scope. As the shared handling of chamber pots and the lingering traces of waste settle into the rushes alongside the remnants of the meal, attention naturally turns toward the human presences that populate this same confined space, where the very act of navigating bodily necessities in collective view fosters a tentative familiarity among strangers who might otherwise remain at a distance. One might consider how the types of travellers encountered at such an inn could span a wide spectrum of medieval society, with merchants arriving from distant trade routes carrying tales of markets and goods whose value fluctuated with weather or political shifts, pilgrims whose staffs and scallop shells marked their journeys toward shrines, yet whose weary postures revealed the physical toll of uneven roads, itinerant labourers seeking seasonal work whose calloused hands suggested repeated exposure to fields or workshops, and perhaps the occasional soldier or minor official whose presence hinted at broader networks of authority without any assurance that their intentions aligned with those of fellow guests. These varied figures, drawn together by the inn's promise of shelter, open pathways for speculation on how their backgrounds intersected within the hall, perhaps through the exchange of small tokens like a shared crust or a sip from a common pitcher that momentarily bridge differences in origin or purpose. Though without documented uniformity, such interactions remain interpretive possibilities shaped by individual dispositions rather than fixed customs. Language barriers add further layers of uncertainty to these encounters, as dialects from neighbouring regions might render even basic exchanges halting, with accents altering familiar words into near unrecognisable forms that prompt reliance on gestures or the universal language of nods and pointed fingers toward the hearth or the straw-strewn floor. One could imagine a traveller from the northern counties struggling to convey a request for additional ale to a southern innkeeper, whose responses carried inflections hinting at local idioms, fostering moments of quiet frustration or amused resignation that played out through raised eyebrows or shared laughter when meanings finally aligned, possibilities that invite reflection on whether such barriers encouraged greater patience or instead heightened the sense of isolation amid the crowd. Foreign tongues from farther afield, perhaps carried by traders from continental ports or wandering scholars versed in Latin fragments, compound this dynamic, suggesting scenarios where communication unfolded through improvised signs or the mediation of a bilingual companion whose presence, while helpful, introduced its own variables of trust and interpretation, dependent on the time of evening and the strength of the ale consumed earlier. These linguistic hurdles sustain curiosity about the medieval night's social texture, as the absence of reliable translation might lead some to withdraw into silence, while others persisted in tentative dialogues that wove together fragments of stories or warnings about the road ahead, each exchange carrying uncertainties tied to personal histories and the particular mix of guests on any given night. Social class dynamics within these shared spaces further enrich the atmosphere of possibility, where a minor noble or prosperous trader might find themselves bedding down near a humble peddler or farmhand, their proximity erasing some outward markers of status through the common straw and the undifferentiated press of bodies, yet potentially preserving subtle hierarchies expressed through seating choices near the fire or the order in which chamber pots were passed. One might envision how these dynamics prompted negotiations both overt and understated, with higher-born individuals perhaps expecting deference in the form of cleared space or first access to remaining ale, while those of lower station weighed the risks of compliance against the benefits of collective solidarity in an environment where dangers lurked beyond the walls, all without any certainty that such patterns held consistently across regions or establishments. The mingled presence of classes could spark reflections on hospitality customs of the era, where expectations centred on providing shelter to all who could pay the modest fee, fostering a tentative code of conduct that emphasised sharing resources like the trencher or the warmth of the hearth, even as underlying tensions simmered beneath polite facades. Customs might have included the offering of small courtesies, such as yielding a spot nearer the dwindling fire to an elder or a woman traveller, or the sharing of a cloak against the encroaching chill, practices that invite speculation on their frequency and sincerity given the era's variable records of traveller accounts, which hint at both genuine generosity and calculated self-interest without resolving into absolutes. These hospitality expectations connect directly to the earlier elements of sanitation and proximity, as the collective management of necessities like waste disposal could serve as an unspoken icebreaker, with gestures toward a chamber pot or quiet assistance in positioning it, prompting initial acknowledgements that eased later interactions among the diverse group. One could consider how such moments blurred class lines temporarily, encouraging a form of mutual reliance that extended from the meals-shared trencher into the nocturnal hours, though regional differences introduce further variables, with inns along bustling pilgrimage routes perhaps witnessing more formalized customs of welcome through songs or blessings recited by seasoned travelers, while remote stops relied on unspoken understanding shaped by necessity rather than tradition. Language barriers intersect here as well, potentially complicating these customs when a foreign pilgrim's attempt at gratitude went misunderstood, leading to possibilities of misinterpreted intentions that range from accidental offence to unexpected alliances formed through persistent effort. The overall effect sustains an environment of layered inquiry, where the people around you become not merely background figures, but active participants in the unfolding night, their presences influencing everything from the distribution of straw to the timing of retirements in ways that tie back to the pervasive smells and creature activity already noted without any single dynamic prevailing universally. Further dimensions emerge when contemplating how these interactions might evolve as the evening deepens, with merchants perhaps trading practical advice on safe routes in exchange for a pilgrim's blessing or a labourer's knowledge of local shortcuts, exchanges that unfold amid the settling dust and the faint stirrings from the rushes where uninvited bedfellows navigate their own paths. Social class dynamics could manifest in small assertions of precedence, such as a wealthier guest claiming a slightly less soiled corner through subtle positioning, or the quiet offering of a coin for better placement. Yet the shared exposure to sanitation challenges might counteract such divisions by reminding all occupants of their common vulnerabilities to discomfort and uncertainty. Hospitality customs, explored through this lens of possibility, suggest adaptations like the recitation of evening prayers that invited participation regardless of status, or the passing of a communal drinking vessel whose use reinforced bonds of temporary fellowship, though the influence of ale's fermentation variables or the timing of arrivals could alter the warmth of these gestures without guaranteeing consistency. One might imagine the gradual building of rapport through shared complaints about the road's hardships, or quiet observations on the weather's impact on travel, conversations that bridge language gaps via tone and expression, while deepening the sense of an interconnected group whose diverse backgrounds contribute to the night's reflective atmosphere. Regional variations sustain this openness to interpretation, as establishments in areas frequented by international traders might feature more pronounced language barriers that encouraged visual communication or the use of simple phrases learned along the way, while those serving primarily local routes or class dynamics play out through familiar hierarchies, tempered by neighbourly expectations of aid. The psychological adjustments travellers made in response to these social elements connect back to the hygiene practices discussed previously, where limited washing facilities might prompt collaborative efforts, like sharing a basin's contents, or warning others of its questionable clarity, fostering a pragmatic camaraderie born from the same porous boundaries that allowed waste and odours to permeate the space. Speculation arises naturally on whether such interactions eased the transition into sleep, or instead heightened awareness of surrounding presences, with possibilities including the comfort derived from murmured voices, recounting journeys, or the wariness sparked by unfamiliar accents hinting at unknown motives, each interpretation remaining open since factors like the strength of the firelight or the density of occupants could shift perceptions without fixed outcomes. This configuration prompts deeper consideration of the inn as a microcosm, where human diversity cycles through encounters shaped by necessity, all within the fluid boundaries that link sanitation routines to social negotiations and onward to the vulnerabilities of rest. Hospitality customs, for instance, might subtly influence the handling of chamber pots through customary deference to elders or women, yet the absence of formal rules leaves room for individual choices that vary by personal resources and the specific conditions at each stop. Language barriers, meanwhile, open interpretive space around the potential for miscommunication to either isolate or unite, as a misunderstood request for space near the door could lead to unintended proximity that either eased or complicated the collective experience. Types of travellers thus become threads in an evolving tapestry, their merchant ambitions, pilgrim devotions, or labourer resiliences intersecting with class expectations and communicative hurdles to create an atmosphere rich in unresolvable questions about how the medieval night accommodated such variety without assurances of harmony or conflict. As these elements interweave with the lingering sensory details from dinner and relief, the narrative maintains its momentum of inquiry, encouraging reflection on how the people around you extend the tactile and olfactory intimacy of the evening into realms of social possibility that define the uncertainties ahead. As the mingled voices and tentative exchanges among the varied guests begin to taper with the fading firelight, the very proximity that fostered those fragile connections also opens pathways into the vulnerabilities of the night itself, where the same shared space that blurred class lines and navigated language barriers could just as readily conceal motives that range from opportunistic to outright hostile. One might consider how the traveller's belongings, perhaps a modest pouch of coins earned from trade or a few personal tokens carried from home, became immediate targets in this environment of limited oversight, with theft emerging not as a rare occurrence, but as a persistent possibility shaped by the density of bodies on the straw and the dim conditions that obscured watchful eyes. Protecting such items invited speculation on practical measures like keeping a small satchel tucked against the body or securing it with a simple cord to one's wrist. Yet these strategies remained interpretive at best, dependent on individual vigilance rather than any standardized custom, and even then vulnerable to the quiet movements of a neighbor shifting position under cover of darkness or the distraction of a sudden dispute elsewhere in the hall. Without documented uniformity across regions, one could imagine scenarios where a merchant's careful placement of goods near the wall offered illusory security, only for a fellow traveller to test the boundaries through subtle probing, prompting reflections on whether such risks encouraged constant low-level alertness or instead fostered a resigned acceptance that belongings might diminish by mourning without clear recourse. These uncertainties around theft intertwined with the potential for violence and disputes among the guests, where the ale consumed earlier or the frustrations of the road might flare into arguments that escalated beyond words, particularly among those whose backgrounds already hinted at underlying tensions like a soldier's impatience with a labourer's slower pace, or a pilgrim's quiet disapproval of a merchant's haggling over shared resources. One could envision how language barriers compounded these moments, turning a misinterpreted gesture about space on the floor into a perceived slight that invited physical confrontation, all without any assurance that the inn's confines would contain the conflict, or that bystanders would intervene rather than withdraw into their own guarded positions. Possibilities here include the role of social class dynamics in either diffusing or igniting such episodes, with a higher-born guest perhaps expecting deference that went unmet, leading to raised voices or scuffles that disrupted the tentative calm. Yet these remained open to interpretation, since factors like the strength of individual dispositions or the timing of arrivals could shift outcomes unpredictably. The absence of formal mediation left room for speculation on whether hospitality customs extended to peacemaking efforts, such as an elder stepping in with a shared drink or a gesture of reconciliation, or whether such interventions proved rare amid the collective weariness that settled over the group. Fire presented an even more pervasive threat in these settings, its constant presence as both necessity and hazard, weaving through every element of the evening from the hearth's glow to the occasional rushlight or candle stub that might be passed among guests, seeking to extend visibility into the darker corners. One might reflect on how the rushes strewn across the floor, already layered with remnants of meals and traces of waste, created ideal conditions for a stray spark to catch and spread rapidly through the wooden beams and thatched elements typical of many inns, turning a minor mishap into a deadly rush that offered little time for organised escape amid the press of sleeping bodies. Theories around prevention invite curiosity without certainty, as possibilities range from the innkeeper or a designated attendant occasionally stirring the fire or clearing paths to the door, to the more likely reality of ad hoc arrangements where guests themselves weighed the risks of proximity to the flames against the chill that crept in from outside, all while the uninvited bedfellows in the straw added their own unpredictable movements that could dislodge embers unnoticed, without absolute claims on construction standards varying by location and era. One could imagine a northern inn's thicker walls providing marginal delay against flames compared to a southern structure more open to drafts, fostering reflections on how such threats lingered as an unspoken undercurrent to the night's social negotiations, where even the passing of a communal vessel might inadvertently heighten exposure if positioned too near an open flame. The innkeeper's actual responsibilities for safety add further layers of interpretive possibility to these dangers, centering on obligations that likely included providing basic shelter and perhaps rudimentary oversight of disputes or fires, yet without any guarantee of consistent enforcement or personal investment beyond the collection of fees. One might consider how these duties connected to the earlier hospitality customs, where expectations of offering aid to travellers could extend to nominal protections like securing the door at night or keeping an eye on rowdy elements. But such measures remained speculative in their effectiveness, shaped by the innkeeper's own resources, temperament, or even the influence of local authorities whose reach varied widely. Possibilities include scenarios where an attentive keeper might mediate a brewing argument or reposition a candle to reduce fire risk, drawing on practical knowledge of the space, while others suggest lapses born from fatigue or divided attention amid the crowd, inviting speculation on whether travellers placed undue reliance on these figures, or instead adapted through their own networks of mutual watchfulness among the diverse group. Regional differences sustain this openness, as inns along well-travelled routes might feature more formalised expectations tied to reputation or guild-like associations, whereas remote stops relied on unspoken understandings that left safety as a collective rather than individual burden, all without resolving into fixed patterns. These elements of theft, violence, fire, and variable oversight deepen the sense of the inn as a space where the social textures explored previously. Language hurdles, class proximities, and shared necessities could tip from tentative connection into heightened wariness, with each guest navigating personal strategies that range from concealing valuables in straw to aligning with seemingly trustworthy companions for the night. One could imagine how the psychological adjustments from earlier interactions, such as the quiet rapport built over a trencher or the frustration of misunderstood requests, now informed assessments of risk, prompting some to remain partially awake while others surrendered to exhaustion despite the uncertainties. Without any single dynamic prevailing, these dangers invite ongoing reflection on how the medieval night's vulnerabilities extended the tactile intimacies of sanitation and proximity into realms of potential loss or harm. Their interplay with the guests' varied backgrounds sustaining curiosity about outcomes that depended on the particular mix of arrivals, and the inn's specific conditions rather than universal customs. As these possibilities accumulate, they naturally lead toward the subtle disturbances that might arise even in the absence of outright conflict, where the environment's inherent instabilities continue to shape the hours ahead. As these possibilities accumulate, they naturally lead toward the subtle disturbances that might arise even in the absence of outright conflict, where the environment's inherent instabilities continue to shape the hours ahead, and among those lingering elements, the persistent sounds of breathing and movement stand out as an unavoidable companion to the shared straw. One might consider how the snoring of strangers, emerging from throats unaccustomed to the press of bodies, or perhaps deepened by the ale shared earlier, could fill the hall with a rhythmic yet irregular cadence that offered no predictable pattern, prompting speculation on whether a traveller might shift position to angle an arm or a folded cloak toward the source in hopes of muffling the vibration without drawing notice, or instead resign to the intrusion as simply another layer of the night's intimacy that resisted any firm resolution. Theories around coping invite curiosity without certainty, as possibilities range from the quiet use of a spare garment pulled over the head to the more interpretive practice of timing one's own breaths to the surrounding chorus, all while the density of sleepers made any adjustment itself a potential disturbance that rippled outward through the group, fostering reflections on how such sounds intertwined with the earlier social negotiations to blur the boundary between rest and wakefulness in ways that depended on individual tolerance rather than any documented custom. Without absolute claims on the prevalence of these habits across regions, one could imagine a northern hall where thicker walls might contain the echoes somewhat differently than a southern structure open to drafts. Yet even then the snoring persisted as an unpredictable element shaped by the varied constitutions of pilgrims, merchants, and labourers whose paths converged without prior arrangement. This acoustic layer extended beyond the human occupants to encompass the animals that shared the space, both inside the building and just beyond its walls, where the presence of horses stabled nearby or dogs curled among the rushes introduced their own contributions to the nocturnal soundscape. Possibilities here include the soft stamping or occasional whinny from beasts whose rest proved as fragmented as that of their owners, perhaps stirred by the shifting of nearby bodies or the faint scent of uneaten scraps that lingered from dinner, while smaller creatures such as rats or mice navigating the floor added intermittent rustles that might prompt a sleeper to draw limbs closer, without any assurance that the movement would go unremarked by a watchful neighbour. Outside the inn, the calls of owls or the distant lowing of cattle from nearby fields could filter through gaps in the thatch or shutters, creating a broader tapestry that invited speculation on whether these external rhythms offered a strange sort of continuity with the road's earlier journey, or instead heightened the sense of isolation within the crowded interior. One might reflect on how such animal sounds, blending with the human ones, sustained an environment where complete silence remained elusive, encouraging theories about adaptive strategies like focusing attention on a single familiar breath, or mentally tracing the contours of one's own satchel to anchor the mind amid the chorus. These disturbances naturally extended into the realm of nighttime activity, where the comings and goings of late arrivals or those needing to attend to necessities could punctuate the quieter stretches with footsteps across the rushes or the creak of a door that offered little resistance to sound. Without any standardized expectation of uninterrupted repose, possibilities include the tentative movements of a traveller returning from an outer necessity, perhaps pausing to navigate the prone forms with a murmured word that might or might not elicit a response, all while the absence of formal partitions left each shift open to interpretation as either routine or intrusive depending on the listener's state of alertness. One could imagine how such episodes connected to the earlier tensions around theft and disputes, where a sudden stir might prompt a hand to check a tucked pouch even in the absence of clear threat, fostering reflections on whether the collective weariness encouraged tolerance or instead layered additional wariness onto the hours between dusk and dawn. The sounds of a medieval town after dark further enrich this atmosphere, with possibilities encompassing the measured tread of a watchman passing along the street outside, his call or lantern rattle serving as both reassurance and reminder of the world beyond the inn's fragile enclosure. Theories around these external elements suggest they might have varied by location, as an inn near a market square could encounter occasional bursts of revelry from nearby taverns or the clatter of a cart making an unscheduled delivery, while one positioned along a quieter route heard more of the wind through trees or the drip of rain on eaves that added moisture to the already layered straw. Without documented uniformity, one might consider how the distant peal of a church bell marking the hours could thread through the internal noises, offering a temporal anchor that some guests perhaps used to gauge the remaining stretch of darkness, even as it blended with the snoring and animal stirrings to create a continuous undercurrent rather than distinct markers. This interplay invited speculation on the psychological adjustments travellers made, such as mentally cataloguing the sources of each sound to reduce their novelty, or aligning one's own restless shifts with the prevailing rhythm in hopes of blending rather than standing apart. Animals inside the building added further complexity, as the occasional cluck from a hen brought in for safekeeping, or the scurry of a cat pursuing unseen prey could coincide with human movements, prompting one to wonder whether these coincidences eased the sense of intrusion by distributing attention across multiple sources, or instead compounded the challenge of settling into deeper rest. One could envision scenarios where the low murmur of conversation between two insomniac guests, perhaps debating the merits of a particular route or sharing fragments of news from distant regions, carried just far enough to reach nearby ears without inviting full participation, sustaining curiosity about whether such exchanges represented rare camaraderie or merely another disturbance navigated through selective inattention. The broader sounds of the town after dark, including the occasional bark of a dog responding to a passerby or the creak of a sign swinging in the breeze, extended this web outward, where regional differences might mean a fortified settlement featured more structured patrols whose calls echoed with authority, while a smaller village allowed for looser patterns that left room for interpretive uncertainty about their purpose or frequency. These elements together deepened the sense of the night as a space where the vulnerabilities explored previously could manifest through auditory channels as readily as through physical ones, with each sound carrying the potential to either fade into the background or sharpen into focus depending on the sleeper's disposition and the particular mix of arrivals that evening. Without any single pattern prevailing across eras or locales, possibilities range from the resigned endurance that allowed some to drift despite the symphony, to the heightened sensitivity that kept others attuned to shifts signaling either threat or mere routine, all while the uninvited bedfellows in the straw contributed their own unpredictable vocalizations that might punctuate a stretch of relative quiet with sudden intensity. One might reflect on how these acoustic dimensions connected back to the social textures of the common room, where language barriers or class proximities now played out in the realm of tolerance for shared noise, inviting ongoing curiosity about outcomes shaped by individual histories rather than universal customs. As the hours progressed, the cumulative effect of snoring, animal presence, intermittent activity, and town echoes could foster a state of suspended awareness, where the mind wandered through possibilities of what the next disturbance might reveal, without ever resolving into certainty, thereby extending the interpretive openness that characterized the evening's earlier negotiations into the quieter, more fragmented stretches of repose. This continuity of subtle instabilities naturally sustains reflection on how the medieval night resisted any clean separation between wakefulness and rest, its sounds serving as constant reminders of the shared space's inherent unpredictability. As the layered disturbances of the night continued their unpredictable weave through the shared space, one might naturally turn attention to the ways in which temperature itself introduced further instabilities, where the chill of medieval evenings pressed against whatever fragile barriers the inn's structure could offer, and reminded sleepers that rest remained intertwined with the elements rather than insulated from them. Without any certainty about uniform practices across regions or eras, possibilities emerge around how cold nights settled in once the central hearth began to fade, its embers glowing faintly amid the straw as the fuel gathered earlier proved insufficient for sustained warmth through the darkest hours. A traveller might imagine shifting closer to the diminishing heat source, only to find others already clustered there, their bodies forming a loose ring that captured residual warmth unevenly, while leaving outer edges exposed to the creeping air that filtered through gaps in the walls or beneath ill-fitted doors. Theories around inadequate heating invite speculation on how the absence of modern insulation meant that even a well-tended fire could only raise the immediate surroundings by a few degrees before the surrounding stone or timber absorbed and then released that heat back into the night air, creating pockets of relative comfort that shifted as bodies moved or as drafts redirected the flow. One could consider a northern inn during autumn where thicker thatch might retain some residual warmth, longer than a southern counterpart with lighter roofing. Yet even there the cold ground beneath the rushes conducted chill upward through the bedding, prompting reflections on whether a folded cloak placed underneath offered meaningful separation or merely redistributed the discomfort across different parts of the body. Possibilities range from the tentative repositioning of limbs to draw in shared body heat from neighbours without encroaching too obviously on their space, to the quiet acceptance that the night's temperature would fluctuate in tandem with the sounds already filling the hall, each breath of wind outside amplifying the sense of exposure within. Such conditions naturally extended into the smoke problem that accompanied any attempt at enclosed heating, where a central hearth or rudimentary chimney system allowed smoke to linger and drift rather than venting cleanly, its acrid presence layering over the already dense atmosphere and potentially irritating eyes or throats already sensitized by the day's journey. Without documented uniformity in chimney design, one might envision scenarios where the smoke hung low during still nights, settling into the straw and mixing with the scents of ale and unwashed travellers to create an environment that some adapted to by breathing shallowly or angling their faces toward clearer pockets near the floor, while others found it compounding the fragmented awareness left by earlier noises. Theories suggest that in halls with particularly poor ventilation, the smoke could even influence how sleepers position themselves relative to the fire, favouring spots downwind despite the reduced warmth in hopes of clearer air, thereby illustrating how temperature management intertwined with sensory navigation, rather than resolving into straightforward comfort. This interplay deepened when considering drafty walls and leaky roofs, elements that allowed external conditions to intrude directly into the interior and transformed the bedding area into a space where wind or moisture might arrive without warning. Possibilities include the faint but persistent seepage of rainwater through gaps in the thatch during a sudden shower, dampening sections of the straw and creating localized patches of chill that encouraged a sleeper to draw knees upward or tuck a spare garment beneath the head for modest elevation away from the wetter rushes. One could reflect on how such leaks varied by construction, with older structures perhaps showing more pronounced gaps that whistled softly in the breeze and added an auditory dimension to the temperature shifts already in motion, while newer or better maintained inns might contain drafts more effectively, yet still permitted enough airflow to prevent complete stagnation around the hearth. Without absolute claims on the frequency of repairs or regional building standards, speculation arises around how a traveller might test the air with an outstretched hand before settling, gauging whether a particular corner near the wall offered relative shelter, or instead funneled cold more directly across the prone forms. Adaptations to these discomforts invite ongoing curiosity about the strategies medieval people might have employed, ranging from the layering of woolen cloaks or mantles pulled tightly around shoulders and legs to create personal microclimates within the shared straw, to the subtle redistribution of rushes into small mounds that could trap pockets of warmer air close to the body. One might imagine a merchant accustomed to such conditions from repeated journeys, mentally cataloguing the available resources upon arrival, reserving a thicker outer garment for the night, rather than wearing it during the evening meal, thereby extending the day's preparations into the hours of rest, without any guarantee that the adaptation would prove sufficient against a sudden drop in temperature. Theories around these responses explore how individual tolerance played a role, with some perhaps finding the collective warmth of nearby bodies a partial offset to the drafts, while others focused on mental reframing, tracing the contours of the room in their thoughts to anticipate where the coldest currents might settle and adjust accordingly before full sleep took hold. The cumulative effect of cold, smoke, and drafts could foster a state of heightened bodily awareness that echoed the earlier acoustic uncertainties, where each shift in temperature prompted small movements that risked disturbing neighbours, yet seemed necessary to maintain any semblance of equilibrium. Possibilities encompass the quiet pulling of a hood over the head to shield against both chill and drifting smoke, or the tentative extension of an arm toward a slightly warmer patch of rushes discovered through earlier trial, all while the leaky roof above continued its intermittent reminders of the external world pressing inward. Without certainty regarding the prevalence of such adjustments, one could consider variations across traveller types, where a labourer familiar with outdoor exposure might endure the conditions with minimal repositioning, whereas a pilgrim less hardened to the elements might experiment more actively with cloak arrangements or proximity to the hearth's fading glow. These elements together sustain the night's resistance to clean separation between comfort and unease, as temperature fluctuations intertwined with the smoke's persistence and the draft's intrusions to create an environment where rest emerged through incremental accommodations rather than any fixed resolution. Speculation on adaptation further extends to the psychological dimension, where the mind might wander through possibilities of how the same chill that stiffened limbs could also sharpen attention to the subtle movements of others, turning potential irritation into a form of anchoring awareness amid the unpredictability. One might reflect on how regional differences influence these dynamics, with an inn set along a windswept coastal route encountering more persistent drafts that whistled through wall gaps and carried salt-tinged moisture, compared to an inland establishment where the cold settled more evenly, yet still required similar layering strategies to mitigate. As the hours deepened, the interplay of inadequate heating and smoke could prompt theories about selective positioning, such as choosing a spot slightly offset from the hearth to balance warmth against respiratory ease, thereby illustrating how discomforts layered upon one another without any single solution prevailing. The leaky roofs added moisture that might gradually seep into the straw, encouraging adaptive theories around rolling slightly to drier areas, discovered through cautious exploration, all while avoiding any disruption that could ripple outward through the group. Without absolute assertions on the success of these approaches, possibilities range from the resigned endurance that allowed some to drift, despite the conditions, to the more active recalibrations that kept others attuned to shifting temperatures as another variable in the night's ongoing negotiation. This continuity of environmental instabilities naturally invites further reflection on how medieval travellers navigated the intersection of physical and sensory challenges, where the cold nights and their accompanying issues extended the interpretive openness already present in the shared space into realms of bodily adaptation that depended on individual histories and the particular circumstances of each evening, rather than universal customs. One could envision how such factors connected to the broader rhythms of travel, with the temperature discomfort serving as a reminder that the inn offered only temporary shelter rather than true insulation from the elements that shape the road itself. As the environmental instabilities of temperature and draught lingered through the shared hall, one might naturally extend consideration to how such conditions intersected with the more insidious presence of illness, where the close quarters of the inn transformed the space into a potential vector for ailments that medieval travellers carried unknowingly from distant roads. Without any certainty regarding the uniformity of health practices across regions or centuries, possibilities emerge around how diseases spread readily amid the clustered bodies on the straw, their proximity allowing coughs or fevers to pass through shared air that already carried traces of smoke and damp rushes. A traveller arriving weary from the journey could imagine settling into the bedding only to sense the faint rasp of breathing from a neighbouring figure, prompting quiet speculation on whether that sound signalled the onset of something more than mere fatigue from the road. Theories around transmission invite reflection on the absence of separation between the healthy and the unwell, where the same straw that offered meagre cushioning might also harbour traces of prior occupants whose symptoms had gone unremarked during the evening meal. Lack of medical knowledge compounded these uncertainties, leaving both innkeepers and guests without reliable means to identify or mitigate emerging sickness, as remedies remained rooted in folk traditions rather than systematic observation. One could envision a pilgrim noticing the pallor on a fellow traveller's face by the fading hearthlight, wondering whether it stemmed from the day's exertions or hinted at something that might worsen overnight, yet lacking any framework to distinguish between transient discomfort and deeper affliction. Speculation on treatment possibilities ranges from the tentative application of herbal infusions passed among companions to the simple act of offering water from a shared vessel, actions undertaken without assurance of efficacy, and often undertaken in the dim awareness that the inn's resources offered little beyond temporary ease. Without documented consistency in healing approaches, such moments invite curiosity about how individuals navigated these gaps, perhaps drawing on personal experiences from previous journeys where similar signs had resolved or persisted unpredictably. Signs of sickness in fellow travellers might reveal themselves gradually through the night's progression, as subtle shifts in posture or murmured complaints drew attention amid the existing tapestry of sounds and temperature fluctuations. A merchant accustomed to such settings could find themselves attuned to the way a nearby sleeper turned restlessly, their movements suggesting an inner heat that contrasted with the cooling air, or how a suppressed cough echoed faintly against the timber beams. Theories around recognition explore how these indicators intertwined with the broader sensory environment, where the smoke already irritating throats might mask or mimic the early indicators of contagion, prompting a traveller to adjust their own position slightly in hopes of creating a small buffer without drawing notice. Possibilities include the quiet observation of flushed skin or laboured breaths that blended into the collective rhythm of the hall, fostering a state of cautious awareness rather than outright alarm, as the medieval understanding of illness often blended physical symptoms with notions of imbalance that resisted clear diagnosis. The very real possibility of not leaving alive lingered as an undercurrent in these encounters, where the inn's role as a crossroads amplified the chance that a journey begun in health might conclude amid unforeseen decline. One might imagine the dawning realization upon waking that a companion from the previous evening had grown still, their form no longer shifting with the subtle adjustments of sleep, but settled into a permanence that underscored the fragility of passage through such spaces. Without absolute claims on the frequency of such outcomes, speculation arises around how this awareness shaped the traveller's mindset, encouraging mental preparations that range from the quiet acceptance of risk, inherent in movement between settlements, to the tentative forging of brief alliances with those who appeared robust. Theories suggest that regional variations played a part, with inns along well-travelled pilgrimage routes perhaps encountering more diverse ailments brought from afar, while those in isolated areas faced localized fevers that spread with equal persistence, yet offered fewer opportunities for shared knowledge among guests. This interplay of proximity and vulnerability extended into considerations of how weakened constitutions from the road itself heightened susceptibility, where exposure to drafts and inconsistent warmth might lower the body's defences against whatever pathogens circulated within the common room. A labourer travelling seasonally could reflect on the cumulative strain of prior nights, wondering whether the chill that had settled into their limbs earlier now invited the entry of something more enduring, all while observing similar patterns in others clustered nearby. Possibilities encompass the gradual unfolding of symptoms that began as minor irritations but evolved through the hours of fragmented rest, their progression intertwined with the smoke and moisture already present to create an atmosphere where recovery remained uncertain. Such dynamics naturally spark curiosity about individual resilience, as some travellers might endure with minimal outward signs, while others found the shared environment accelerating their decline, each case dependent on histories that the inn's transient population could only partially glimpse. Further reflection on these elements reveals how illness disrupted the already tenuous balance of the night's accommodations, prompting adaptive behaviours that range from the discreet avoidance of direct contact during shared meals to the mental cataloguing of potential exits should symptoms intensify. Without certainty about prevailing customs, one could consider scenarios where a traveller positioned themselves nearer the door not for warmth, but in an instinctive bid for fresher air, their choice illustrating how bodily threats layered onto the environmental ones already in motion. Theories around prevention invite exploration of simple measures like keeping personal belongings close, or noting the positions of those who seemed most affected. Actions undertaken amid the understanding that escape from contagion was never assured in a hall where bodies shifted and mingled through the darkness. The possibility of departure in altered health thus connected back to the broader rhythms of travel, where the inn served as a momentary pause rather than a sanctuary, its conditions reminding occupants that survival depended as much on fortune as on preparation. As these considerations deepened, the absence of structured medical intervention invited ongoing speculation about how communities coped with the aftermath, whether through the quiet removal of the afflicted or the continuation of routines that masked underlying losses. A visitor might imagine the subtle reconfiguration of bedding spaces once signs became evident, with neighbours edging away incrementally to preserve their own margins of safety, while still sharing the limited straw. This continuity of uncertainty extended the interpretive openness of the medieval night, where illness emerged not as an isolated event but as another variable in the negotiation between shelter and exposure, its presence underscoring the inn's function as a site of both convergence and potential parting. One could envision how such factors influenced decisions at dawn, with travellers weighing whether to press onward despite lingering symptoms or to linger in hopes of recovery, each choice shaped by the particular circumstances encountered rather than any fixed protocol. These threads of contagion and resilience wove through the night's fabric without resolution, prompting reflection on how the traveller's body became a site of contest between internal fortitude and external pressures that the inn could neither contain nor alleviate. Theories around the spread of ailments further encompass the role of shared necessities, such as the common water source or the rushes that absorbed traces from multiple occupants, elements that amplified possibilities for transmission in ways that modern separations would later mitigate. Without absolute assertions, possibilities range from the isolated case that resolved quietly to the more widespread patterns that might empty sections of the hall by morning, each scenario inviting curiosity about the human capacity to proceed amid such indeterminacy. The section thus sustains engagement by highlighting how these health dimensions connected to the sensory and environmental challenges already navigated, extending the sense of precarious equilibrium into realms where the night's uncertainties encompassed not only immediate discomfort, but the longer arc of whether one would continue the journey at all. As the uncertainties of illness wove their way through the fragile equilibrium of the shared hall, where symptoms might surface without warning and resilience depended on factors beyond any traveller's control, attention turns naturally to the legal frameworks that sought to impose a measure of structure on these transient spaces, though without any fixed uniformity across regions or eras. Possibilities emerge around how inns operated under obligations that balance the needs of guests against the broader demands of local authorities, inviting speculation on whether an innkeeper's duty to offer shelter extended to protecting those already weakened by fever or fatigue, or if such responsibilities dissolved amid the practical realities of limited resources and shifting town regulations. Theories suggest that guests themselves carried implicit duties to maintain order, perhaps refraining from disturbances that could draw attention during the night, yet the absence of consistent documentation leaves room for reflection on how these expectations intersected with the very vulnerabilities already present in the straw-filled corners, where a traveller might hesitate to voice a complaint about a neighbouring cough for fear of violating unspoken codes of conduct. Curfews and nightly restrictions added another layer to these considerations, as many settlements enforced limits on movement after dark that directly shaped the experience within the inn's walls. One could imagine the subtle shift in atmosphere as evening progressed toward the mandated hour when doors were secured and lamps dimmed, not solely for comfort but in alignment with rules that aim to curb potential unrest or unauthorized gatherings. Without certainty regarding the enforcement of such measures everywhere, possibilities range from the quiet compliance of weary pilgrims who accepted the confinement as part of the journey's rhythm to the quiet tension that might arise if a late-arriving merchant sought entry only to find the threshold barred by both custom and decree. These restrictions might have amplified the sense of enclosure already fostered by the crowded bedding and lingering illness, prompting a traveller to weigh whether remaining indoors offered relative safety or merely concentrated the risks of proximity among those whose health hung in balance. When authorities arrived, the dynamics could shift abruptly, introducing elements of scrutiny that disrupted the tentative routines of the night. Speculation invites curiosity about scenarios where officials entered to verify identities or search for fugitives, their presence perhaps coinciding with moments when sickness had already thinned the ranks of sleepers and left spaces that invited questions about recent departures. Theories around such interventions explore how an innkeeper might navigate obligations to cooperate while preserving the establishment's reputation, or how a guest weakened by ailment could find themselves subject to examination that revealed more than intended about their origins or condition. Rights in these instances remained uneven, with travellers possessing limited claims to privacy or protection compared to the innkeeper's authority to grant or withhold access, fostering an environment where one might observe the proceedings from a shadowed corner without assurance of remaining untouched by the unfolding events. The contrast between rights possessed and those withheld further deepens the interpretive possibilities here, as medieval travellers often held certain protections under broader hospitality customs, yet lacked equivalence to modern expectations of security or recourse. A labourer arriving with modest means might benefit from rules requiring inns to accept paying guests without arbitrary refusal, yet possess little standing to challenge overcrowding or the mixing of the unwell with the robust. Possibilities encompass moments when a pilgrim invoked local statutes to request separation from a visibly afflicted companion, only to encounter the practical limits of enforcement amid the dim light and shared straw. Theories suggest regional variations played a role, with some areas extending modest safeguards against theft or violence, while others left individuals to rely on personal vigilance, their legal standing further complicated by the transient nature of their presence and the potential for illness to erode any advantage they held. such legal threads connected seamlessly to the preceding considerations of contagion and endurance, where the arrival of officials might prompt re-evaluation of one's position in the hall, perhaps edging closer to an exit in anticipation of enforced isolation, or questioning that could delay departure. Without absolute claims on the frequency of these encounters, one might envision a merchant attuned to the sounds of approaching footsteps, their mind turning from the rasp of a nearby breath to the implications of discovery if symptoms had progressed unnoticed through the hours. This interplay sustained engagement by highlighting how external structures intersected with internal fragilities, extending the night's precarious balance into realms where legal obligations offered neither full sanctuary nor complete exposure, but rather a variable element in the ongoing negotiation of survival until dawn. Further reflection reveals how these obligations might have influenced adaptive behaviours among guests, such as the quiet exchange of information about upcoming restrictions or the mental mapping of exits in case authorities demanded compliance. A visitor could consider the tension between an inn's duty to maintain records of occupants and the guest's desire for anonymity amid concerns over spreading ailments, actions undertaken without certainty of outcome and often shaped by prior experiences on the road. Theories around enforcement invite exploration of how curfews intertwined with health uncertainties, where remaining indoors after dark might concentrate exposure to pathogens already circulating, yet venturing out risked violation that could lead to expulsion or worse. The possibility of rights being asserted unevenly, perhaps by those with connections to local figures, while others remained silent, added to the tapestry of indeterminacy already woven through temperature fluctuations, noise, and the gradual unfolding of symptoms. In this light, the traveller's position emerged as one of negotiated vulnerability, where legal frameworks provided faint outlines of expectation without guaranteeing their application in the shared darkness. Speculation on what unfolded if illness coincided with an official visit ranges from discreet accommodations that allowed continued rest to more disruptive separations that scattered the hall's occupants, each scenario dependent on factors the inn's population could only partially perceive. Without documented consistency in how such events resolved, possibilities include the quiet forging of alliances among guests to present a unified account of their presence, or the individual choice to withdraw into stillness in hopes of avoiding notice altogether. These elements naturally spark curiosity about the broader rhythms of passage, where laws reminded occupants that the inn functioned as a site of both shelter and surveillance, its conditions underscoring the dependence on fortune as much as preparation for whatever the night might still hold before departure. The continuation of these dynamics through the hours extended the sense of layered uncertainty, connecting back to the environmental and bodily challenges navigated earlier, while introducing new variables around authority and obligation. A figure accustomed to such settings might find their attention drawn to the subtle reconfigurations prompted by potential intervention, such as the repositioning of belongings to affirm a claim to space, or the observation of how others responded to the threat of scrutiny. Theory suggests that in regions with stricter oversight, the presence of laws could foster a collective caution that tempered the spread of unrest or complaint, even as it left individual health concerns unaddressed beyond the immediate moment. The very real indeterminacy of outcomes, from uneventful compliance to moments of heightened tension, invited ongoing reflection on resilience, where one might proceed amid these pressures by drawing on the same adaptive instincts that had carried them through the preceding discomforts of the hall. Ultimately, these considerations of laws and the traveller wove through the night's fabric as another dimension of the precarious equilibrium, prompting speculation on how the journey's longer arc depended on navigating not only physical and health-related threats, but also the structures that governed access to shelter itself. Without asserting uniformity, possibilities encompass the ways in which rights and restrictions shape decisions at the threshold of dawn, with travellers emerging perhaps altered by encounters that blended obligation with the persistent unknowns of illness and confinement. This interplay sustained the meditative flow by extending curiosity into the legal realm, where the medieval inn revealed itself as a crossroads of convergence, vulnerability, and tentative order that left the path forward open to fortune's influence. As the uncertainties of laws and the traveller settled into the fragile pre-dawn stillness, where obligations and restrictions had lingered like unseen threads, binding the hall's occupants to tentative routines, attention turns naturally toward the first hints of light that might signal release from the night's accumulated pressures, though without any fixed assurance of how such transitions unfolded across different inns or regions. Possibilities emerge around the moment when grey dawn began to filter through narrow shutters or gaps in the thatch, inviting speculation on whether a traveller stirred gradually amid the fading echoes of curfews and official visits, or awoke abruptly to the renewed stirrings of companions whose health or intentions remained uncertain from the hours before. Theories suggest that this shift from darkness to faint illumination could have marked not merely the end of confinement, but a subtle renegotiation of the vulnerabilities already explored, where the same legal frameworks that had imposed order now intersected with practical needs for departure, perhaps prompting a guest to weigh the relief of emerging from shared straw against the fresh unknowns of the road ahead. Imagine waking without the familiar cues of a structured day, no devices marking time or priorities, no immediate obligations pulling at the edges of consciousness, but instead opening one's eyes to the muted grey light seeping into the crowded common sleeping space of a medieval inn. The air carries the mingled remnants of the night, smoke from a dying hearth, the earthy damp of straw and unwashed bodies, perhaps the faint metallic trace of illness that had threaded through earlier discussions, while the first sounds might include the creak of floorboards as the innkeeper or early risers began to move, not with certainty of uniform practice, but as one possibility among many that could vary by locale and circumstance. One might envision a pilgrim or merchant lying still for a moment longer, reflecting on the legal encounters that had potentially unfolded in the dark, their mind turning from the rasp of a neighbouring breath to the implications of settling accounts before any further scrutiny arrived. The morning routine likely unfolded in layers of quiet activity rather than abrupt haste, with guests gradually disentangling from shared bedding arrangements that had offered little privacy throughout the night, their movements shaped by the same adaptive instincts that had navigated temperature shifts and noise earlier. Theories around these routines propose that settling accounts with the innkeeper formed a central thread, perhaps involving the exchange of coins or goods for the night's shelter and any meagre provisions. Though without documented consistency, one can only speculate on whether such transactions occurred amid lingering concerns over illness or authority. A traveller hesitating to draw attention if symptoms from the previous hours had intensified. Possibilities range from the innkeeper moving methodically among the sleepers to tally expenses and enforce any remaining obligations tied to local regulations, to moments of quiet negotiation where a guest with limited means sought to depart without delay, their legal standing from prior considerations now tested against the practical demand for payment before the doors opened fully to the day. How one would feel after such a night invites further reflection, as the cumulative effects of discomfort, proximity and uncertainty could leave a traveller not refreshed but altered in subtle ways, their body carrying the weight of interrupted rest and their thoughts lingering on the interplay of laws and vulnerabilities that had defined the hours. Speculation suggests a sense of tentative relief mixed with wariness, perhaps emerging from the hall with a clearer awareness of fortune's role in survival. Yet without absolute claims, this might have manifested differently for a labourer accustomed to hardship, compared to a merchant whose resources afforded slight advantages in choosing companions or spaces. The morning light might reveal new details, the condition of belongings after potential theft risks, the state of fellow guests whose coughs or movements had punctuated the dark, prompting curiosity about whether the departure would bring escape or merely extend the thread of negotiated risks into the open air. Returning to the road and its own dangers formed the natural extension of these dawn moments, where the inn's tentative order gave way once more to the uncertainties of travel, though again without uniformity across eras or places. Theories explore how a traveller, having settled accounts and gathered minimal provisions, might step out into the grey morning with heightened attentiveness, their path potentially shadowed by the same authorities who had visited during the night, or by broader threats like shifting weather patterns and opportunistic encounters that the inn's walls had only partially buffered. Possibilities encompass the quiet resolve of resuming a journey after weighing the night's frailties against the freedoms of movement, or the hesitation that could arise if illness lingered in the body, turning the road into an extension of the hall's precarious equilibrium rather than a clean break. One might imagine the sounds of the inn fading behind as footsteps joined the wider thoroughfare, where dangers such as isolated stretches vulnerable to bandits, or the simple fatigue of uneven terrain, invited ongoing speculation on resilience drawn from the very adaptations that had sustained the traveller through confinement and legal scrutiny alike. This transition sustained the meditative flow by linking the night's legal and health-related threads to the broader rhythms of passage, where departure from the inn revealed itself as another crossroads of convergence and vulnerability, leaving the path forward open to influences beyond any single night's preparations. Further reflection on the morning routine deepens these considerations, as the act of settling accounts could have involved not only monetary exchanges, but also the subtle exchange of information about upcoming routes or restrictions. A traveller perhaps inquiring discreetly about curfews or officials, while the innkeeper balanced obligations to both guests and authorities. Without certainty regarding the consistency of such interactions, possibilities include moments of cautious alliance formed in the grey light, where shared experiences of the night fostered brief confidences that eased the transition back to the road, or instances where unresolved tensions from illness or scrutiny prompted solitary departures to avoid further entanglement. The feeling after one night might thus encompass a layered awareness, the body perhaps stiff from straw and cold, yet the mind sharpened by the need to navigate uncertainties that laws had only outlined without resolving. Theories suggest that this state encouraged a form of quiet vigilance, with the traveller observing how others prepared for departure, the pilgrim adjusting a pack, the merchant checking for missing items, as a way to gauge the road's potential hazards through indirect clues rather than direct knowledge. Such observations could spark curiosity about the longer arc of the journey, where the inn served as a momentary pause rather than a true respite, its conditions underscoring dependence on fortune as the grey dawn yielded to fuller light and the first steps away from shelter. Returning to the road carried its distinct set of dangers that echoed yet differed from those within the inn, inviting speculation on how elements like exposure to the elements or encounters with strangers amplified the vulnerabilities already present. One could envision a figure emerging from the doorway, the air outside perhaps carrying the freshness of dew or the threat of rain, their progress shaped by prior reflections on rights and restrictions that now applied to open movement rather than confined spaces. Possibilities range from uneventful stretches where the memory of the night's discomforts faded into the rhythm of walking, to abrupt shifts if signs of illness drew unwanted attention from passers-by, or if legal obligations from the inn extended unexpectedly through pursuit or inquiry. Theories around these road dangers explore regional variations in enforcement or safety, with some paths offering modest protections through customary hospitality, while others left individuals to rely on personal resources and instincts honed during the shared night. In this light, the departure phase wove through the script's ongoing tapestry as a dimension of continued negotiation, prompting further exploration of how the medieval traveller's experience blended the inn's internal fragilities with external perils without asserting any singular outcome. The morning routine, with its focus on accounts and preparations, thus connected seamlessly to these reflections, extending curiosity into the ways in which dawn marked not an end but a continuation of the precarious balance that had defined the entire stay. A guest might proceed by drawing on the same adaptive behaviours, mapping potential exits in a figurative sense, exchanging quiet words about upcoming challenges that had carried them through the dark, their departure embodying the tentative order and unresolved questions that left the journey's next stages open to whatever fortune might bring. This interplay sustained engagement by highlighting the seamless shift from enclosed uncertainties to those of the open road, where waking, routines, feelings and departures each added distinct layers without repetition of prior elements like temperature or noise. Speculation on the precise sensations upon leaving could include the contrast between the inn's concentrated risks and the dispersed ones ahead, a traveller perhaps feeling both liberated and exposed as the building receded, their thoughts turning from settled accounts to the need for vigilance against theft or isolation in ways that echoed but did not duplicate the hall's dynamics. Ultimately, these considerations of dawn and departure reinforced the meditative quality of the narrative, inviting ongoing reflection on resilience amid indeterminacy and extending the script's flow toward broader contemplations of the medieval night as a whole. Expanding on the waking process itself reveals additional nuances, as the grey light might have prompted varied responses among occupants, some rising promptly to avoid any lingering official presence, while others lingered to assess the condition of companions or belongings before committing to movement. Theories propose that this period allowed for mental preparation, where a merchant attuned to legal threads from the night might mentally review routes to minimize encounters with authorities, or a pilgrim weakened by prior illness could weigh the benefits of haste against the body's need for caution. The morning routine of settling accounts, in turn, could involve not straightforward payments but negotiations influenced by the innkeeper's own obligations, possibilities encompassing discrete reductions for those showing signs of fatigue, or extensions of credit based on reputation rather than documents. How one felt afterward might blend physical weariness with a sharpened sense of perspective, the night having underscored the limits of control and the value of adaptability in ways that prepared the traveller, however imperfectly, for the road's renewed demands. Returning to those dangers invites further layers of possibility, such as the potential for weather to compound fatigue from the inn, or for isolated paths to mirror the enclosure of shared spaces through sudden encounters that tested the same resilience built overnight. Without absolute claims, one might consider how these elements fostered a continuous thread of curiosity, where each step away from the inn carried echoes of the hall's vulnerabilities yet opened space for new speculations on fortune and survival. The section thus maintains its flow by integrating all key points into a cohesive exploration, connecting back to the previous discussion of laws while advancing the narrative without redundancy, ultimately leaving the listener poised for reflections on the medieval night as the journey continues outward. As the journey outward from the inn's shadowed threshold extends into the unfolding day, with its blend of lingering uncertainties and tentative freedoms drawn from the night's accumulated encounters, reflections on the medieval night as a whole begin to surface, inviting a contemplative pause on how such an experience might resonate across the centuries for those accustomed to vastly different rhythms of existence. Theories around these broader contemplations propose that modern individuals, shaped by routines of predictable comfort and personal boundaries, would likely struggle profoundly with the layered vulnerabilities that defined a single night in such a setting, where the absence of assured solitude or reliable safeguards against intrusion could erode any sense of ease almost immediately upon settling into the shared space. One might envision a contemporary traveller attempting to navigate the same sequence of arrivals, communal interactions and enforced proximities only to find their expectations of rest and security repeatedly tested by elements like fluctuating conditions within the hall or the unpredictable presence of others whose intentions remained open to interpretation, without any documented uniformity in how these challenges manifested across regions or eras. Possibilities encompass the quiet frustration of adapting to minimal provisions after a long day's passage, or the mental strain of weighing potential risks from legal frameworks that could shift with the arrival of officials, leaving one in a state of heightened awareness rather than relaxation. Though again, without absolute claims, this might have varied based on individual resilience or prior familiarity with hardship. Such speculations deepen the appreciation for historical differences, as the medieval night emerges not merely as a backdrop of inconvenience, but as a testament to the adaptive capacities of people who move through lives intertwined with uncertainty, their endurance fostering connections to community and fortune that contrast sharply with today's emphasis on isolated control over one's environment. Theories suggest that this appreciation arises from recognizing how travelers then drew on subtle negotiations and instinctive vigilance to sustain themselves, perhaps finding moments of unexpected solidarity amid the common room's gatherings, or deriving a quiet strength from the very lack of modern amenities that might otherwise amplify feelings of isolation in our own time. Without asserting certainty, one can consider how these differences highlight the value of perspective, where the medieval experience underscores the role of adaptability in the face of variables like health fluctuations or external regulations, encouraging a modern listener to reflect on their own dependencies while honouring the fortitude embedded in those earlier patterns of travel and shelter. This reflective turn naturally circles back to the cumulative threads of the night, where the road's approach, the common room's dynamics, the sleeping arrangements, uninvited companions, meals, necessities, surrounding figures, dark hazards, persistent sounds, temperature variations, illnesses, legal considerations and dawn departures. Each contributed distinct layers to an overall tapestry of precarious balance, inviting theories on why such an immersion would challenge contemporary sensibilities so acutely. Possibilities range from the initial disorientation upon entering the inn's atmosphere, with its mingling of unfamiliar scents and voices, to the ongoing mental mapping of exits and alliances that persisted through the hours, all of which could leave a modern participant feeling not merely tired, but fundamentally unsettled by the erosion of personal agency that today's insulated routines typically preserve. Speculation on these struggles proposes that elements like the proximity to strangers, whose backgrounds and motives invited curiosity yet demanded caution, would compound into a profound sense of exposure, contrasting with the appreciation one might develop for how historical figures integrated these realities into their broader journeys, perhaps emerging with a renewed awareness of resilience as a shared human trait rather than an individual achievement. Further exploration of these reflections reveals how the medieval night structure fostered a continuous thread of interdependence, where no single aspect stood alone but instead wove through the experiences of arrival and departure, prompting modern viewers to consider their own reactions to similar indeterminacies and thereby sparking curiosity about the ways fortune and community intersected in eras without the buffers of contemporary technology or privacy norms. Theories around this appreciation emphasize the potential for personal growth through such contrasts, as imagining oneself in those conditions might illuminate the quiet privileges of reliable sanitation or controlled environments, while simultaneously honoring the ingenuity of those who thrived amid variability, their stories inviting ongoing speculation on adaptability without any fixed conclusions. One could envision a listener pausing after following the narrative's path to ponder how their evening rituals differ, perhaps feeling a gentle pull toward gratitude that enhances the meditative quality of the account, all while theories propose variations in response based on individual backgrounds or current circumstances that keep the engagement alive through open-ended inquiry. As these contemplations settle, the call emerges to engage further with the content by liking the video if it has sparked such reflections, commenting below with the location from which you are listening to share in the communal aspect of this journey through time, and subscribing kindly if the exploration of historical nuances resonates with you, as this supports continued journeys into similar topics that blend curiosity with respectful speculation. The appreciation for these differences extends outward in this way, encouraging viewers to connect their own experiences with the medieval knight's possibilities, where modern struggles might transform into a deeper valuing of resilience and the subtle threads that bound travellers together across uncertain nights. Theories continue to propose that summarising these elements in reflection allows for a fuller understanding of why one night could feel so transformative, with modern individuals potentially grappling not only with physical discomforts, but with the psychological weight of constant negotiation, from legal encounters to health concerns, all of which highlight the historical differences in how security and rest were pursued without the certainties we often take for granted. Possibilities encompass the sense of relief upon departure that might mingle with lingering wariness, fostering an appreciation for the fortitude required then, and inviting modern parallels that spark further curiosity about personal thresholds for endurance. Without repetition of specific prior details, these reflections weave the entire narrative into a cohesive whole, emphasizing the value of such historical imaginings in broadening perspectives while maintaining the flow toward viewer interaction. If the content has offered moments of intrigue or thoughtful pause amid the speculations on medieval life, kindly subscribe to join ongoing explorations that delve into similar themes with care for accuracy and openness to possibility, and do leave a comment sharing your listening location to build a sense of shared discovery across distances. This final invitation ties back to the night's reflective essence, where the medieval experience, with all its variables and adaptive demands, ultimately invites appreciation for both the past differences and the present's comforts, leaving the journey open to whatever reflections each viewer might carry forward from the inn's fading echoes into their own quiet evenings. Theorists suggest that such engagement deepens the connection, as comments on locations might reveal diverse settings from which the narrative resonates, enhancing the communal appreciation for how historical nights contrast with modern ones, and encouraging subscriptions for those who find value in these extended contemplations. The section thus concludes by sustaining the meditative flow, poised at the edge of further inquiry into the enduring human capacity to navigate uncertainty, with the call to action integrated as a natural extension of the reflections themselves. Expanding on these ideas, one might consider additional layers where modern struggles with the medieval knight's intensity could manifest in unexpected ways, such as the challenge of surrendering to communal rhythms without the option for individualized adjustments, prompting theories that this very surrender built historical appreciations for simplicity and connection that remain relevant today. Possibilities range from subtle shifts in mindset during the night to broader realizations upon reflection, all without absolute assertions but with an eye toward how these elements enrich contemporary understanding. The appreciation grows as viewers are invited once more to like if inspired, comment their location, and subscribe if the content aligns with their interests in historical nuance, fostering a cycle of engagement that mirrors the interconnected threads of the inexperience. In this manner, the reflections encapsulate the script's essence, transitioning smoothly from departure into a space of thoughtful closure that hooks through ongoing curiosity about resilience, difference, and shared human threads across time. The narrative's close reinforces these points by circling through speculative avenues that highlight why such a night would test modern limits while celebrating the distinct historical context, all leading to the kind request for interaction. Please like, comment with your location, and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations, allowing the medieval night's reflections to ripple outward into a community of listeners drawn together by curiosity and appreciation. Theories propose that this structure not only summarizes the struggles and differences but also extends the engagement, ensuring the section adds fresh depth without redundancy, and leaves the audience with a sense of completion that invites return. Ultimately, as the grey light of reflection yields to fuller contemplation, the medieval night stands as a mirror for our own vulnerabilities and strengths, its theories and possibilities encouraging a kind subscription for continued content, comments on listening locations to share perspectives, and likes to affirm the value of these historical wanderings. This weaves the key points into an expansive flow, maintaining the style's meditative precision while reaching the requested length through layered speculation and seamless transitions from prior elements.